Chapter 6. Horseback riding with the kids on Friday was great because this time Keith convinced Maggie to trot, which was more fun watching than it should have been. Friday night, he made it a point to be upstairs in time for prayers. On Saturday morning, he hit the breakfast table with one goal in mind. "I'm going to run into town today to pick up some stuff," he said as if he hadn't thought every word through 1,000,000 times since they'd walked out of the laundry room. "Oh?" she asked. Sitting at the table, she picked small pieces off of a blueberry muffin. He hunched over his bowl to avoid looking at her so that maybe she would believe he really didn't care one way or the other. "Yeah, I was thinking, if y'all want to come with me, you can." The picking stopped, and she stared at him. "Us? Why would we go into town?" "Well, I needed to hit Walmart to get supplies for my place when I get banished there again on Tuesday." He shrugged to take the edge off that statement. "I thought you might want to go get some stuff for you. You know, clothes and stuff." She narrowed her eyes and then raised her eyebrows. "Yeah, like I have the money to do that." How he ever thought he could do this and be nonchalant about it, he didn't know. He swallowed the nervousness along with the Cheerios. "Well, I could loan you some until you get paid. I'm sure you'll be getting something by next Friday." "Yeah, like my pink slip." He started to protest, but when he looked at her, she smiled softly. It was obvious she was teasing as well as considering his offer, so he ducked his head over the bowl and let her alone with her thoughts. "Maybe I could get a few things," she said, but quickly added, "Not much, just a couple." The smile from his heart couldn't be stopped. Cool. He finished off the last of the Cheerios, stood, and grabbed his hat from the table. "I'll be up to pick you guys up about 12:30. "That'll work." She was gazing up at him, which had a way of short-circuiting his brain. "If you're sure you don't mind." "Hey, I don't ask if I mind." The more she thought about it, the more Maggie knew he was too good to be true. Stable, kind, generous. How could you get all of those in one package? There were only a couple of problems. One, she had no way to know if he felt the same way. Two, maybe he was nice to everybody, and she was reading way too much into his kindness toward her. Three, and this was the biggest of all, by Tuesday morning, he would be a memory in the rearview mirror. This job was an eggshell crack away from disintegrating around her. She felt it every time that he wasn't around, and so it was comforting to have the promise of a whole afternoon in his company. Car seat standing sentinel on either side of her on the top step, she stood with Isabella in her arms and Peter peering out from behind her leg. For the 78th time, she checked her watch. He should have been here by now. If Patty Ann caught them out here with no better explanation than she had prepared, Tuesday might come a lot sooner than Tuesday. Relief poured through her when the shiny red Dodge Ram pickup pulled around the corner and up to the front. He hopped out and yanked the back door open. "Sorry I'm late. I had trouble with the water pump." Maggie picked up a car seat and started to him. He took it from her and she handed him the other as well. "Nothing serious, I hope." "Nah, the motor went out. Just took a little gerrymandering." At the pickup, he worked to put Isabella's seat in first, then went around to put in Peter's. "So, you ready for a trip into big old Pine Hill?" "I don't know. I haven't been outside these gates in what feels like forever." Keith smiled as they each strapped in a child. "Well then, by all means, we don't want you to feel like a prisoner." As she climbed into the pickup, Maggie had the feeling that she had never felt so free in her entire life. All the way into Pine Hill, which was only a 20-minute drive, the conversation sailed smoothly. She was so easy to be with, so easy to talk to, so spirited, but with a maturity and control Keith found fascinating. "So you were from where originally?" "Midland," she said, and she pulled one jean-clad leg up to her other. My dad worked for the city. My mom taught. Then, when I was 8, everything changed.
You moved to Del Rio.
She shook her head on his glance over. No, I went to Lubbock first. They had an opening. It was less than wonderful. Her soft laugh ripped his heart out. I was there for almost a year. Then I moved to Carlton for a while. That one wasn't much better, but I really liked the school there. The history stopped for a moment. Mrs. Baker. Man, I haven't thought of her in a long time. She really started me into the reading thing. I could just lose myself and everything else in the pages. It was something sane to do when everything was going crazy around me. Her voice slid into the memories, and Keith glanced at her again, sensing the things she wasn't saying. Finally, she ducked her head and continued. That one lasted 2 years. She let out a breath. Hard to believe I even made it through that one. There was no doubt the pain she was pushing down with each word. There were 2 stops after that. San Antonio with, what was their name again? Abigail, something like that. They were okay, but we were in a really bad neighborhood. She glanced back into the back and chose not to continue with that line of thought. Then there was Mineral Wells for 6 months, and then I landed at Mrs. Malinowski's.
In Del Rio.
Yeah, she was great, real inspiration. Unbelievable lady. Maggie let out a long breath as her gaze drifted out the side window. I think she saved my life, to be honest with you. Sadness, fear, and hard-fought acceptance laced every memory. After a moment, he felt her gaze slide to his, and he glanced at her. She smiled. It's been a long ride. Well, maybe this is where all of that was leading. Why he said it, he had no idea, but he wanted with everything in him for it to be the truth. I hope so. She looked out the side window again. I really hope so. Keith had never met anyone as unassuming and unpretentious as Maggie. Up and down the aisles of Walmart they walked. They'd already gotten 2 pairs of shoes, a pair of tennis shoes and a pair of white dress shoes, both of which were on yellow tag, "Please take them, we're begging you" sale. Once they made it to the clothes, things didn't improve. He'd pick up a shirt or pants or a skirt for her to consider. She liked it until she saw the price tag, and then she'd shake her head and put it back. At the extreme clearance sale rack, she found a shirt for $5 that wasn't much better than what she had on. It wasn't that he cared what she wore, but he knew there were people back at the mansion who cared very much. If he had any chance of getting them to consent to let her stay, he had to find a way to convince her to get something nicer without totally cutting her off at the knees over her wardrobe. "Maggie," he said in frustrated disbelief when she put a white scrunch skirt back on the rack. "Why did you put that back? $12 is not that much." $12 is $12. That could buy 5 bags of cereal if you get the right ones. She walked around the rack as he pushed the cart with Isabella in the front and Peter sitting amidst Keith's purchases in the back. His brilliant idea wasn't going to work if she kept this up.
Tell you what, I'll pick something, and you have to at least try it on.
But
I didn't say you have to buy it, just try it on.
She scrunched her face as he started sorting through the rack next to him.
What size? He asked.
Keith.
I said, what size?
She exhaled hard and crossed her arms in front of her. 8.
This is nice, and it's an 8.
He pulled a red tank top from the rack. From the other side of him, he fingered a blue blazer and sorted until he found the right size. Holding them up, he wished he'd paid more attention on his shopping trips with Dallas. These are good. He put those 2 in the cart. How about orange? That idea was rejected nearly the second after he'd made it, more by him than by her. On the next rack he stopped. Smoke-colored, with white flowers and vines, the dress looked just like something Dallas would wear. However, this one would never fit in Dallas's price range.
And this?
He flipped it into the cart. Maggie raised her eyebrows skeptically. At the next rack, he examined the choices. Nice. Yuck. Here. He flipped another skirt into the cart. Pushing forward, he was halfway to the next rack when his cell phone beeped. He pulled it out, hit on. This is Keith. Keith, man, dude, where have you been? I was about to call the FBI. Hey, Greg. He pushed the cart a little farther on and started sliding the hangers in each direction. His brain put the conversation with Greg on autopilot. What's up, man? I've called your place and left like 5 messages. I called the stables and left a message there, too. Where have you been? You know if you want to catch me, my cell's the best way. He held up a dark turquoise and white striped top. Maggie didn't look convinced, but he put it in the cart anyway. Besides, I've been staying up at the mansion this last week. He held up a white skirt and added it to the others. So, what's up? Well, I was wondering when the big engagement shindig is, for one thing. Oh. That threw Keith off for a minute. Week from today. At the mansion? Yeah. Well, are you coming over sometime so we can hang out before the old ball and chain gets back, or what? Keith shifted the phone to the other ear, picked up one more shirt and then another skirt, and put them in the cart. How's Friday? He felt guilty about leaving his best friend hanging, even if he did have a zillion other things to think about. I need to go potty, Peter said from the cart, and Maggie looked at Keith. The multitasking was beginning to fry his nerves. Friday works for me, Greg said. You want to just meet at Tony's for pizzas and we'll go from there? Maggie waved Keith down even as she lifted Peter from the cart. We'll be right back. Gratefully, Keith nodded. Yeah, okay. His attention swung back to the conversation. Friday at Tony's. He sorted through the next rack, found nothing, and pushed the cart forward. They were running out of options. And what time's the big party start on Saturday? It took some searching to locate the information in his brain. 6:30. Dallas is flying in that morning at 10. I'll go pick her up, and then her folks get here at... The correct times slip-slid through his mind, not stopping long enough to lodge there. He pulled another shirt out, examined it, and put it back. 1:15, something like that, I think. I'm sure we'll pick them up and then head back up to the mansion. You talked to Dallas recently? Yeah. This conversation was raking horrible feelings through him. Last night, the night before last. She's good, studying her brains out. You know Dallas. He caught sight of Maggie on the other side of the store, but coming toward him. Listen, Greg, I've got to get. I'll talk to you Friday. Don't be late. You know me. Yeah, I know you. Don't be late. Keith laughed at that. Later, man. He hung up just as she walked back up. She started to put Peter in the cart, but at hip level, she realized how much stuff was in there. I'm not buying all of this. You're right. You're not. I am. You want to try it on, or just take it? Her gaze came up to his, and shock laced the edges of it. Keith? No, this isn't a discussion. You're getting whatever fits. So, do you want to try it on here or take it home and try it on there? Your choice. She shook her head in frustration and checked her watch. It's almost 2. The kids are exhausted. We'd better get back, or Patty Ann is going to go ballistic, if she hasn't already. In the front of the cart, Isabella did a forward bob as sleep dragged her down. Keith looked at her, and although he wanted some confirmation that the clothes would fit, he knew Maggie was right. Okay, but don't weasel out on me. You will keep and wear anything that fits. Me? Weasel? Maggie shot him an innocent look that stole his heart. I never weasel. The kids were down for a nap, which took next to no effort to pull off. Maggie went to her room where the Walmart bags were stacked on her bed. She shook her head. Somehow, in the time she'd been gone, he'd accumulated far more than she'd wanted to get. Worse, He had sent her to the pickup with the kids so she couldn't see how much it had all cost. With a sigh, and knowing she couldn't keep it all, she pulled the turquoise and white striped shirt out. She held it up to her and turned to the mirror over the dresser. A smile slid through her heart. He was crazy. She really loved that about him. "Hey, sorry I'm late," Keith said in one short string of words as he strode into the dining room at 6:05. He put his hat on the chair at the head of the table and was almost in his own chair when he took one look at her and stopped dead. Wow. He tilted his head to the side and ran his gaze up and down her. Nice. Her smile was a mix of happiness and shyness. Like it? With her hair pulled up and back from her face, the white collar just over the first turquoise stripe set off her skin. Slowly, he lowered himself into the chair. "Are you kidding? They won't know who you are when they come back."
"Eat, eat, eat!"
Isabella knocked her hand on the high chair tray. The food was already on the table. "Did y'all already pray?" he asked, looking at Maggie, which wasn't exactly safe at this point. "We were waiting for you." His heart filled his chest. "Well, there's a good excuse." He held out his hand across the table to her, and she took it. Taking Isabella's hand in hers, Maggie bent her head. "Dear Father, we thank you for this food and this time together again. Watch over us and be with us tonight and always. Amen." He loved hearing her pray, and it was getting harder and harder to not let his brain catalog everything else he was starting to love about her. "You don't go to church?" Keith asked later as he followed Maggie to her door after their few minutes on either side of Peter's bed. She pulled on his heart like a magnet, drawing him with her, making him want to stay with her, as crazy as that sounded. "Church?" The question turned her around. "Yeah, you know, big building with a steeple on it." Annoyance drifted over her. "I know what church is. Why are you asking?" He shrugged. "Just a question. You pray like you were born in church. I just thought, well, I wondered. Tomorrow is..." She lifted her chin in understanding. "You're wondering why I don't go on Sundays?" "No." Sheepishly, he glanced at her. "I was wondering if you were planning to go tomorrow." That thought wound through her eyes. "Well, I don't know. I don't really have a way to go unless I take my car, and I don't know how far I'd trust it. Besides, I can't just take the kids, and I can't leave the kids either. Something tells me Patty Ann would take a very dim view of that." He laughed. "Not to mention Inez." "Yeah, there's a comforting thought." She sighed. "I don't even know where the churches are around here, or what time they start." With one hand, she lifted the waves of hair out of her face. "But you'd go if that stuff wasn't a problem?" She anchored her arms over her middle. "Well, yeah, probably. But they are a problem." Keith's gaze took all of her in. The A-shirt, the tan pants, the gentle undulating waves over her soft, innocent face. He shouldn't make the offer, and yet not making it would kill him. They would only get this one chance, and as stupid as that was, he would never forgive himself if he didn't take it. "Tell you what, you get the kids ready and meet me out front at 9:30. Her eyebrows lowered. "The car seats are still in my truck." She shook her head, but he hated pleading on most occasions, but this time it felt more like the only way to keep her from saying no. "Please, Maggie, let me do this for you." She gazed at him. Why? His smile was barely there. "Because I want to, that's why." Chapter 7. Isabella was perched on Maggie's hip, Peter on Keith's, as the four of them walked into the little church on the other side of Pine Hill. Keith hadn't been in this church in a long time. When he sat down in the bench and put Peter on his lap, Keith's gaze went to the front. In his mind, the casket still sat right there. With barely a sigh, he was right back there, the incomprehension, the sadness, the fear wrapping around him. Stoicism dropped into his heart. He wouldn't cry. He hadn't then, and he wouldn't now. At that moment, Maggie looked over at him and smiled. If he'd had only a small amount of sanity less, he would have reached over and taken her hand. He knew what that hand felt like in his. It was wrong, but he wanted to feel it again and again, forever. Hardly smiling at her, he turned his gaze up front. He could do this. For her, he could do this. He needed to, if only to pay her back for giving him a piece of himself he had lost so long ago. Bowing his head, he let his mind go back to the memories waiting there. Her perfume, her gentleness, her tenderness, his heart filled with the memories of the woman who had shaped him into the man he was today. "I'll be back, Keith, I promise," she said again in his memory, and he had no trouble at all recalling that voice. "You be good while I'm gone." Emotion surged to the surface, but he beat it back. He hadn't done the best of jobs of keeping that last promise. He had tried, but it wasn't exactly the easiest assignment in the world. The service started, and Keith stood Peter next to him. Once on his feet, Keith glanced over at her. With Isabella on her hip and God in her eyes, Keith wondered how much she looked like his mother surely had, standing in this church with a little tow-headed boy standing right next to her. He put his hands on the bench ahead of him and arched his shoulders forward. She had been gone for 17 years, but to him, she had never really left. "You want to stop somewhere and eat?" Keith asked when they were back in the pickup. Maggie turned to him pensively. "We'd probably better get back. I'm sure lunch will be waiting." "Yeah, right." It took him more than a minute of driving before he got the emotions firmly put back in their place. Then he glanced over at her. "So, what do you say? Horseback riding tomorrow? We could go out to the waterfall." "Waterfall?" "It's not bad. Real easy ride. The kids will love it." His heart was now talking for him. "We could take a picnic, spend a few hours, let them play in the water. It's supposed to be nice tomorrow." "I don't know. Inez might—" "Let me worry about Inez." Maggie looked over at him, obviously still not convinced. "You don't think they will be mad?" He didn't really care what they would think. Nah, it's one day, one afternoon. How could they get mad about that? Maggie did her best to have everything ready Monday morning, but life wasn't cooperating. Peter seemed to have grown 2 inches overnight, and suddenly nothing fit. She would have to mention that to someone, the prospect of which did not sound inviting. Isabella was not in the best of moods, and Maggie wondered if she might be getting sick. There were no real, solid signs, but a general lethargy that seemed to drag on the little girl's spirit. "Are you not feeling good?" Maggie asked, and Isabella looked at her from the changing table with wide eyes that told her no more than she already knew. "Well, I think swimming is out for you today, little one." With the child's clothes changed, Maggie picked her up and turned Peter for the kitchen. "Let's get some breakfast. We've got lessons to get done before Keith gets back to take us riding." Her heart bounced on the mention of his name. Church the day before had been so wonderful. It was strange because she wouldn't have pegged him for a churchgoer, and in truth he had looked rather out of place. Yet he took her because he knew she wanted to go. Something about that made her heart dance. At breakfast, he was normal Keith again, down to earth, nice, and work-focused. Ike called again. Apparently they had made it back from the race. Cumane had gotten third. She couldn't tell how he felt about that. In fact, information about reality was having a hard time crowding out information about how her heart felt every time he was around. He stood from the table and grabbed his hat. "I'll be back about 11. I talked to Inez. She'll have lunch ready to take." Maggie nodded, watching him and wishing she could stop time. Here in the breakfast area, him standing there, hat in hand, life felt so right, so perfect, and she never wanted that to end. "We'll be ready." Ready they were, standing on the top step as if they belonged nowhere else. Keith had to pull in a breath before he could hit the door with his shoulder to get out of the pickup. Ike would never understand, but that was okay. They had today, and right now to Keith, that's all that mattered. "Who's ready to go riding?" he asked, as his heart soared ahead of him up the stairs.
Me!
Peter jumped from the step into Keith's arms. He was happier than Keith had ever seen him. "Well, what are we waiting for?" They got the kids into the pickup. Maggie crawled in the front, unlocked her seatbelt. "I don't think we're going to get to do the water thing." "Oh, why not?" "I don't think Izzy's feeling all that great." Keith looked back into the seat behind Maggie. "Why not?" "I don't know. She's just not herself this morning." The concern was evident in Maggie's demeanor. "You think she needs a doctor?" "No, not yet anyway, but I also don't think she needs to be inviting a cold either." He had yet to put the pickup in drive. "You still want to go?" She smiled at him. "I think the sunshine will do her some good." Her gaze fell to her jeans. "Besides, who knows when we'll get to do this again?" The melancholy of what happened tomorrow hung over her, and with everything in him, Keith wanted to make it evaporate. "Then, we'll have a great day today, and let Jesus take care of everything else." Surprise jumped to her face, but when she looked at him, he smiled. After a couple seconds, she nodded. "Oh, it's beautiful." They were the only words Maggie could think to say when the horses approached the waterfall. The shelf of rock high above dropped the water over its edge like a hand dropping pearls. In the bright sunlight, the water glinted and glimmered like 1,000 tiny diamonds. Her gaze stayed on the falls as she got off and pulled Isabella down too. "Oh, baby girl, look at that! Look how pretty!"
Pity,
Isabella said, and happiness burst through Maggie. She nosed her face into the soft blonde curls. "You are the cutest thing ever, you know that?" "Come on, you two," Keith said, tilting his head and smiling at them as he stood there, the basket in one hand and Peter's hand in the other. "You're wasting daylight." Through the calf-high flowers, Maggie stepped over to him and followed him right up to the second shelf of rock, which stood between the fall above and the pool of water below. Carefully, she sat down. "This is incredible. I've never seen anything like it." "One of the hidden treasures of the place," Keith said. "The drive up is murder on vehicles, so most people don't bother to come out here." "But the horses didn't have much trouble," she said with concern. "No, luckily they're open accessed out here." Kneeling, he started laying out the picnic: sandwiches, potato chips, and little silver bags of juice. Maggie wondered if he would die of starvation before they got back. She'd seen him eat, and this didn't look like nearly enough. "You come out here a lot?" "Not much anymore. I used to come out here a lot." She helped him and then set Isabella on her lap and tore her a piece of sandwich off. "What happened to that?" He shrugged. "I got busy. Things to do, people to see, places to go, you know how it is." "So they keep you pretty busy, huh?" She took a half sandwich for herself. "Always something. They'll be taking Q-Main to Del Mar in a couple of weeks, and we're trying to get Transistor and Dragnet ready, too." Maggie laughed. "Where do you come up with these names? They sound like some kind of sci-fi aliens or something." Keith smiled. "Well, some come with our own names if we buy them somewhere else. Some we come up with on our own if we've bred them in-house." "In-house?" "From our own stock. You breed them so the mare's qualities complement the stud's, and, hopefully, you get a racehorse that's fast as lightning and strong as an oak." He was feeding Peter. She was feeding Isabella. "That's not always easy, I take it?" she asked, fascinated by the topic and by his apparent knowledge on the subject. "No, it's not that easy. Sometimes, instead of the best of both worlds, you get the worst of both worlds. Then you've got a nag that has the manners of a spoiled brat." She laughed. "You've had a few of those, I take it." He scratched the bottom of his chin. "More than our share, but we're learning." "We're?" "Me and Ike, the trainer." She lifted her chin in recognition of the name. Ike, the 50-something guy who, although way out of her age bracket, was still the gentleman every girl dreams about snagging. "You guys get along pretty well, huh?" "He's like a second father to me." Keith's gaze faded from her out onto the falling water as he chewed his sandwich. "I loved horses, couldn't get enough of them, and Ike took me under his wing and showed me the ropes. He still does." "You've been here a while, then? At the Ayers' estate?" He smiled. "Yeah, a while." His face slid through the memories. "I graduated from A&M when I was 24. I've been here ever since." "And how long is ever since?" His gaze came back to her. 5 years. She nodded, doing the math in her head. "And you like it here?" This smile was more wistful than the others. "Yeah, I love it here." The day passed like none had ever passed before for Keith. When the sun got hot, they found a cool shade near the falls and let the kids take a nap. Lying on the ground, Isabella next to her and Peter's hand in hers, Maggie looked like she belonged nowhere else. She never complained, even when he knew she must be uncomfortable having been in the same position too long. Every move she made, every effort, every word came with a question of what was best for the kids clearly in mind. "You're good with them," Keith said when they were both asleep, and he had ambled back over to the little group from his trip to check the horses. "Yeah, well, they're easy to be good with." She twirled one finger through Isabella's curl. Keith sat down and wound his arms around the backs of his knees, which were Indian style under him. "You wouldn't believe the nightmare those two have been through. Those other nannies were—" He exhaled in disgust. "Yeah, I figured as much." Her gaze fell to Peter. "What does that mean?" Maggie's gaze came up to his, and Keith didn't like what he was reading there at all. "The other day, yogurt day, Peter kept cringing away from me like I was going to hit him." Her gaze fell. "I've seen that look before with kids that have grown up being beaten." Real, honest concern swept through him. "You don't think they've ever—" She shrugged slightly. "I wouldn't be surprised the way he was acting, and he's so quiet. He's terrified to get dirty. Any little wiggle throws him into terror." She exhaled. "Lots of signs, lots of pieces, and when you put them all together—" Somehow Keith had never realized this could be a possibility. Yes, the kids weren't treated like kids, but beaten? That wasn't something he'd ever thought was happening to them. "You should have seen him petting the cat the other day," she continued. "It was like he was petting it with one hand and watching out of his eye for the reprimand he knew was coming. They have them on such a tight schedule. You get chewed out for being 2 minutes early. I don't know. They've got everything, you know? The playhouse, the toys, the nice house. But they aren't allowed to be kids." Deep in the middle of his heart at that moment, Keith made the solemn promise to himself that whatever he had to do to keep her here, he would do it. For their sakes. They deserved that much. "Having everything isn't what makes you feel loved," she continued, although his heart already felt like it was overflowing like the falls. "It's knowing that you're loved just because you're you." She slid her fingers over Peter's hair. "Every kid deserves that." The words stopped so she could take a breath. "I wish I could give that to every kid alive. Just the solid, unshakable knowledge that they are good enough just the way they are, that they are loved for who they are. Just that much. It could change the world. Had the world quaked out of existence at that very moment, Keith couldn't have moved. Finally, he understood the attraction of her. She cared, not about the money and the cars and the status. She cared about the person.
"Well, I for one hope you get that chance," he said softly.
Her gaze slid up to his, and she smiled gratefully. It was the most perfect moment of his life.
"It's about time you get back," Ike said, stepping up as Keith put Buck into his stall. Instinctively, Maggie backed away without really moving. She cradled Isabella a bit closer and reached down to shield Peter as well. "I took the day off, I told you that," Keith said, and there was a bite to his words. "Well, the operation didn't. Hodges' truck showed up, and they only have half the load."
Not really understanding, but wanting to not get in the way just the same, Maggie shrank back. If she could have thought of a way to get the kids back to the mansion without riding in the pickup, she would have done it. Keith exhaled.
"Fine." He turned to her slightly. "This'll just take a minute."
"No problem," she said so softly she wasn't sure he'd heard. Keith and Ike started to the office, and Maggie followed with the kids, very cautiously and hanging back as much as possible. She considered telling him they would wait in the pickup, but he and Ike were in a heated discussion, and she didn't want to break in and add more stress to the already tense situation. At the office, Keith yanked the door open and stomped inside. Ike followed him, but stood at the door with it open. Maggie, careful to shield the children, stood 10 steps back and faded against the shadows next to the hard, gray wood of the barn. She could hear the angry voices rising as the tension stretched over them.
Maggie, why is Keith so mad?
Peter asked at her knee. "Shh," she said, pulling him closer. "Don't worry, they're just trying to get some things settled. How do you explain something you don't even understand?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Ayer," the young driver said, backing past Ike out of the office door. "It won't happen again."
"You're darn right it won't happen again. Tell Hodges we get jerked around one more time like this, and we'll find a different supplier permanently."
Keith whacked the clipboard into the young man's chest.
"You understand that?"
"Oh, yes, sir, Mr. Ayer. I'll tell him."
"Good. Now get off my property."
The words spun through Maggie's brain in a whirlwind of concern and incomprehension. Mr. Ayer? Why did he keep calling Keith that? And why had Ike let Keith handle that when he was obviously the most senior of the two? Mr. Ayer. Mr. Ayer. The name twisted through her, and she pulled Peter closer to her, trying to make time run backward, even as she swayed under the reordering of the world around her.
"They'll do it again,"
Ike said, when the young man was gone. He put one hand on his hip where his brown belt went through the loops, just so.
"I know they will."
Keith looked so mad Maggie wasn't sure what he would do next.
"Get Mac on the line and tell him we'll start buying from them on Friday. Then call Hodges and tell him they're out."
The glance that Ike sent in her direction did nothing to settle Maggie's nerves, which were in knots inside her.
"What about your dad?" "Let me worry about Dad. He doesn't have to put up with his junk every day like we do. Friends don't jerk friends around like that. Hodges just barked up the wrong tree."
Keith stomped back into the office, and Ike followed. Once inside, the voices were too indistinct to make out, and with her head pressed against the barn wall, Maggie fought to block them out altogether. Keith was Mr. Ayer's son. Mr. Ayer, Conrad Ayer, was Keith's father. Her breathing became shallow to the point of being non-existent as her heart broke through that understanding. Slowly, her mind traced through the last week. Over and over again, she had humiliated herself in front of the boss's son. She had leaned on him when her own stupidity caught up with her. Worse, she had told him things you didn't tell people who could get you fired. She felt like the biggest idiot on the planet. Her eyes fell closed against the thoughts,
Stupid, stupid, stupid. Tears came to her eyes, stinging and harsh, but she beat them back. Sniffing, she squared her shoulders. He must think she was the most gullible imbecile to grace the planet. Yeah, right, he worked so hard out here. What a joke. He was the crown prince of $1 billion estate. At that moment, the voices approached the door, and Maggie sucked in the emotions swirling around her. She wouldn't let him win. He would never know that she hadn't known. More than that, she would never let him so close again. He was Keith Ayer. She was the hired hand, and for her heart and her sanity, not to mention her job, she'd better remember that. "I'll be up at the mansion till morning," Keith said to Ike, who followed him out. At the office door, Ike stopped, holding the door open with his back. "Dad and Vivian will be back bright and early tomorrow." His voice had a hard edge to it that pulled up fear in Maggie's chest, and it wasn't only her. Peter's fingers dug into her jeans in a crunch. Isabella whimpered at her chest, and Maggie pulled her closer. "Shh, little one, shh." "Maggie, you ready?" Keith asked, looking past Ike. "Oh, yeah." Her voice cracked, and she shook her head in aggravation at herself. He turned in the direction of the pickup, and Maggie stepped that direction as well. When she passed Ike, he looked at her with a mix of disgust and revulsion she couldn't miss. She ducked her head, lest he see the tears in her eyes. Hurt piled over hurt the farther she walked. When they walked out of the barn, and she saw Keith standing at the truck, her heart cracked in two. She closed her eyes and then pulled them back open, fighting the hurt with everything in her. "We'd better get back. I've got to get the kids a bath before dinner. They smell like horse." At her side, Maggie opened her door, and then Isabella's, but Peter never moved from her knee. "Patty Ann will toss me out on my ear if she gets wind of them." "Pete, come over here," Keith said, his anger dissipated. But Peter was going nowhere. Quickly, Maggie latched Isabella in, and then took hold of Peter's hand. Around the back of the pickup she strode, purposefully raking the hair out of her face. On his side, Keith stood solidly by his door, waiting for Peter. However, Maggie never gave him the chance to do so much as touch the child. "I'll get it." He backed into the space of his door, but only that. She didn't care. Anger snapped through the hurt, and at the moment, that was a far better choice. At least that way she didn't have to worry about crying in front of him and completely humiliating herself. When Peter was latched, she reached up and ruffled his hair. "Good boy." Then she stepped back and slammed the door. "What are you standing around for? You want Patty Ann to fire me?" Keith seemed not to have a good answer for that as he stared at her in concerned incredulousness. "No, why would I want that?" Maggie swallowed every word she wanted to yell at him. Instead, she stomped around the front of the truck and got in on her side. On his, Keith got in too. He started the pickup and backed out. All the way home, she felt his gaze chance on her every so often, but she kept hers planted outside the side window. If she just kept her distance, tomorrow would be here in no time, and by tomorrow, she was sure she would never have to worry about getting too close to him again. Once he told them everything he knew, she would never again be welcome at the Ayer mansion. Of that much, she was 100% positive. She was mad, furious, livid. That much Keith was absolutely sure. Why? He was having trouble getting his brain to figure out. Okay, so he'd lost his temper at the stables. Surely she wasn't so naive as to think you could never get angry. After all, he did run a multi-million-dollar operation. That meant he had to make some decisions, and that sometimes things needed a serious adjusting, like Hodges and his manipulations. That was one that needed rectified in a flat hurry. When they pulled up to the house, Keith barely had a chance to get Peter out of the back before she was around the pickup to get him. Whatever had happened to their nice day together had been soul-splittingly triumphant in ruining everything. Maggie wouldn't even look at him. Everything in him wanted to make her look at him like she didn't want to jump off the side of the earth to get away from him. "I'll be back for dinner." "Whatever." It was all he would get as she turned and stomped up the steps. Consternation such that he had never felt crashed around him. She acted like she hated him, but only an hour before, they were under the tree watching the kids sleep. The aggravating issue stayed with him the rest of the afternoon and through dinner, during which she hardly said 2 words and never so much as looked at him, and right through her taking the kids upstairs. He had never felt so panicked in his life. Whatever it was major, and the question of why she had done such a drastic 180 kept drifting through him. At first he wrote it off to mood swings, but when he was in his room later, his thoughts fought to put the whole puzzle together, and no matter how hard he tried, it just didn't fit. Finally, although it was taking his life in his hands, he knew he had to go ask. His heart slammed into his chest, warning him that this might make it worse, but in truth, he couldn't see how it could get any worse. Quietly, he left his side of the mansion and made his way to hers. The soft light of the hallway nightlight guided his steps until he was standing at Peter's door. Keith pushed it in slightly, not wanting to disturb their already in progress ritual. "And please help us have a good day tomorrow," Maggie prayed, her head down, bending over Peter's bed. Keith heard the struggle in her voice, and he knew without a doubt that she was worried about the coming morning. He wasn't looking forward to it either. If things could just stay like this, he would be perfectly content to live here forever. Guide us, protect us, keep us, help us, and love us. Amen. There was a soft rustle of blankets.
I love you, Maggie.
The words drifted to Keith, and he peered in. Peter was in her arms, hugging her like he never wanted to let her go. "I love you too, little one." The hug lasted a few more moments, and then she pulled him away. "Now, you get some sleep." She pushed to her feet and stopped. Softly, she kissed her 2 fingers, and then pressed them to his forehead. "Good night, little prince. Sleep well." Even after she was finished, she didn't move for a long moment, and out of respect for her privacy, Keith backed out into the hallway to wait for her. When she came out, he heard the sniffle and felt the anguish pouring from her even though he couldn't clearly see her face. In the soft light, she shut the door before wiping her eyes and letting out a long, slow breath. "Maggie?" he said softly, and she jumped a foot and spun to face him. Her face fell into a glowering distrust, even though he was leaning against the wall, not exactly poised to pounce on her. Bitterness scrawled across her face as she turned slightly away from him. "What do you want?" "Can we talk?" Head down, she headed across the hall to her door. "We don't have anything to talk about." He pushed away from the wall and stepped over to her door. There, he again leaned against the wall and lowered his head so he could look at her. "I think we do." She shook her head and reached for her doorknob. "It's late. I need to get to bed." Gently, he reached out and touched her wrist, praying she wouldn't leave. "Maggie, please. I know you're mad, and I want to know why." "I'm not mad." She shook her hair back defiantly and looked at him. Chin up, that unmistakable air of determination flowing through every fiber of her. Why would I be mad? The middle of him ached with the hate in her eyes. "I don't know. Why are you?" Her gaze broke from his and darted across the hall. "Look, I get it, okay? I know the score. It took me a while, but you don't have to worry. I get it now." Concerned incomprehension traced through him. "Maggie, you're not making any sense. What are you talking about?" When she smiled at him, there was nothing in him that liked it. She looked cold and hateful and detached. "You're the prince of Conrad Ayer Industries. My bad. I thought you were just a nice guy who cared." The words hit him like punches, and he dropped his hand from her wrist. You you didn't know." With her jaw set, she shook her head. "No, and you didn't bother to tell me that little detail either." His head dropped as understanding poured through him. No wonder she'd seemed so unnaturally normal around him. That explained a lot. Too much, really. He sighed that understanding into his heart. "I'm sorry, really I am. I assumed you knew." "No, I didn't know." Abhorrence and hurt dripped from the statement. Her gaze dropped from him to the carpet. "Well, you got what you wanted. Congratulations. Mission accomplished." Panic plowed into him. What does that mean? "Oh, come on, Keith. I'm not stupid. I know a spy when I see one." That punch just about leveled him. "What? A spy? I wasn't spying on you." She laced her arms over themselves. "Oh, yeah? Then why have you been hanging around all week? Why have you been asking me about my past? Why have you watched my every move with the kids, even coming up here at night to check on us?" She put air quote marks around the last 3 words with her fingers. "I'm not completely stupid, you know." Hurt and hate bled through her gaze. "I just hope you can explain it to Pete and Izzy when I'm gone tomorrow, because they're going to be crushed, thanks to you. Not that you ever really cared anyway." That one brought his defenses up. "Okay, now that's not fair. You know I love those 2. "Yeah, so you say. But how do I know that's the truth? How do I know anything you say is the truth?" With determination, he turned full on her. "Okay, that's it. Look at me." When she didn't, he put his hands on her shoulders and turned her to face him. "I said, look at me, Maggie." Her gaze met his, but there wasn't an ounce of trust anywhere in them. "I love those 2 kids like they were my own. I don't like what's been happening to them any more than you do, and despite what you think about me, I do not want you to leave. I have not been spying. Watching, yes. Spying, no. Now, you can hate me forever, that's fine. But don't you dare use that as an excuse to leave them, because they need you more than you can know." "Oh, yeah? Well, what about your dad and Mrs. Ayer? They'll be back tomorrow, and I'm pretty sure Patty Ann and Inez will have plenty of stories to relate when they get back." She set her mouth. "Let's face it, like it or not, I'll be out tomorrow." His hands dropped from her shoulders, and he leaned back against the wall. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do, and so do you." Her head fell to the side. "I may be what the kids need, but I'm sure not what the parents want. I knew that the first day. It's only a matter of time now, even if they don't fire me outright tomorrow." The thought of her leaving, driving away, never coming back, stabbed through him like a twin-edged sword. "I'm sorry. I really am." "Yeah, well, it was an impressive show while it lasted. That whole working out of the stables thing, you sure had me fooled." He felt like he'd gone 16 rounds with a heavyweight champion of the world. Even his breath was gone. "That wasn't a show. I really do work out there." "Yeah, I'm sure, and it's such hard work, too." Her sarcasm bit through him, taking his knees out from under him. He slid down the wall, hearing in her voice exactly what every other person he'd ever met believed about him. She stood there, over him, arms intertwined, ready to kick him once more with her words if she hadn't finished him off already. He could feel her gaze, but the numbness of hurt gripping him wouldn't let him look at her. She hated him, and he didn't blame her. "I really do work," he said softly to the air in front of him. "I know, that's hard to believe." He shook his head and let it fall back onto the wall, so he was looking at the top corner of the opposite side of the hall. "I don't know. Maybe that's not even really true. You're probably right. I'm just a spoiled little rich kid who wouldn't know what hard work was if it bit him in the butt." The inescapable truth of his lousy excuse for an existence cracked over him, and his spirit plummeted. He had tried so hard to prove to everyone that he wasn't just Daddy's little puppet, that he was his own man, that he could make it on his own. What a joke! She saw through that sham as surely as everyone else did. The feelings of worthlessness clogged the top of his chest, and for the first time in his life, he let them come. She hated him almost as much as he hated himself, and that was saying something. Then, slowly, gently, he felt her not leave, but bend down next to him, and this time her gaze was soft. "I'm sorry. That really was uncalled for. I shouldn't have said that." A smile of sad acceptance slipped through him. "No, you just said what everyone else is thinking, except they don't have the guts to say it to my face." Her gaze surveyed him as she searched for some way to take back her words and ease the hurt she had caused. He let his head fall to the side so he could look at her. It was over. He might as well finish it off. "I'm engaged." And the word snaked through her face slowly, and her hand dropped from his shoulder. What? Their friendship was completely trashed now. There was no reason not to burn it all the way to the ground. Besides, Keith knew it would be better to kill whatever was left of them now, get it over with in one gut-crushing whack, than to drag it out. That was cruel, and would hurt her more in the end anyway. This way, she didn't have the stupid idea that he was worth getting to know. She would see what a jerk he was and get out while the getting was good. He twisted his lips into a half-smile, half-frown, fighting not to let the words dig into him. His gaze fell to his knuckles, which were sliding back and forth through his palm. "Yeah, June 3rd. He nodded without feeling it. "Dallas Henderson, Lowell Henderson's daughter." Her eyes widened. "Lowell Henderson, the senator?" "That's the one." Keith exhaled hard. "She'll be here Saturday. Big, huge bash to celebrate the engagement. All the most powerful people in Texas, that kind of thing. It's the wedding of the decade, or so I'm told." Carefully, Maggie let herself down onto the carpet next to him and leaned her back on her bedroom door. It took more than a minute for her to respond. "And this is a good thing, right?" As strange as that sounded, she actually sounded concerned, as if she cared one way or the other. "Of course it's a good thing." The words came with firmness, and he was glad for that. "It's just, I should have told you sooner." Her gaze did a little circle dance until she let her head crack back on the door. "Well, I wish you would have, but I understand why you didn't." She didn't say anything for a long moment, and then she let her gaze fall over to his. "Is she nice?" He nodded slowly, but never looked at her. "Good," she said, and he heard the feelings lacing the sides of that single word. "You deserve nice." Chapter 8. Maggie had the distinct feeling that sunrise would find her heart no longer beating. It had withstood so many blows the day before, there was no way it would make it to morning. They had talked a bit longer, but Keith looked beat with a whip, and she didn't feel much better. So, with a simple good night, they had left whatever they were, whatever they might have been, at the threshold of her door. It was hard to get herself going, but she knew there really wasn't a choice. Yes, Keith had been a nice addition to life at the mansion, but that was a dream. Today was back to reality. Quickly, she pulled the red top and blue blazer on. She might not fit here, but at least she could pretend to look like she did. When the limousine pulled up at the front of the mansion, Keith pulled up right behind it in the red Dodge. He wanted the first shot at his dad, if at all possible. "Here, let me get that," taking 3 bags from the driver who was piling them on the driveway. "How was your trip?" "Wonderful," Vivian said. "Great, until the flight home," his father said with characteristic blustering.
Oh, now, Conrad, it was not that bad. Besides, we got it ironed out.
Humph. It was his father's standard comeback in any disagreement with Vivian. Well, we're glad you're back. We're all still in one piece. Keith opened the front door and stepped back for them to enter. However, even he wasn't prepared for the welcome on the other side. There, standing on the bottom step, stood Maggie, looking like a CEO, a look of sheer determination etched on her face, and both children firmly in hand. "Good morning, Mr. Ayer, Mrs. Ayer. It's great to have you back." With a slight push, she nudged Peter forward to greet them.
"Well, aren't you precious this morning?"
Vivian said, and she actually bent down to Peter's level. Keith's gaze went from them to Maggie as she descended the last step and leaned toward Vivian so Isabella could go to her mother. Never before had Keith been so awestruck. Her hair was pulled back so that it was a slim cascade down her back rather than in unruly waves around her head.
"Oh, and little Isabella, look at you. You grew so much while we were gone."
Vivian's arms were around the child, and Isabella squealed in delight. Both Vivian and his father laughed. "Good morning," Patty Ann said staidly as she descended the stairs behind them. All gazes snapped up to her, and the levity evaporated in one whoosh. Vivian gave Isabella back to Maggie and straightened, pulling on her suit jacket.
"Hello, Patty Ann. I'm glad to see everything still in place."
"Yes, ma'am, it is." The look of disapproval she shot Maggie hit Keith on the ricochet. Maggie was right. Patty Ann was out for her, and unless he did something quick, she-wolf number 1 would rip apart all of Maggie's hard work and leave it in shambles. "Dad, I hate to take you away like this, but we had an issue with feed again. Do you mind?" His father let out a long exhale. 5 minutes back, and already there are problems. "Hey, they didn't take a vacation like you did," Keith said, trying to lighten the mood. "Ma'am," Patty Ann said, "we need to go over this week's schedule."
"Of course, Patty Ann," Vivian said. "But let me get settled in first. I smell like airplane."
With one more haughty glance at those assembled in the foyer, Patty Ann turned on her heel and marched up the steps. Keith noticed the visible, although only barely, sigh that went through Maggie. She looked over at him, and there was only the slightest of smiles. Then she took Peter's hand.
"Come on, Peter. Hashiki will be here for your karate lesson in 15 minutes.
The child followed Maggie up the stairs, and Keith felt the weight of his current undertaking fall on his shoulders. "Are we going to do this or not?" his father asked harshly. Pulling every bit of divine guidance to him, Keith turned to follow his father. "Guide me and protect me, Father," he prayed softly. "And Mom, if you're listening up there, I could use all the help I can get here." As he stepped into his father's office, courage came into Keith. He shut the door behind him. "We need to talk, Dad." "That's what you said. What's up with the feed situation?" Keith shook his head, sat down, and pulled his hat, then his bandana off his head. "That can wait. This is more important." "Oh?" "It's about Maggie, Ms. Montgomery." His dad sat down with a thump. "Uh-oh." It took everything he had not to drop his gaze, but he stayed steady. "You need to know that while you were gone, she and I got to talking, and, well, there are some things you need to know about her." His father waved him off. "We already know about her background. Vivian and I have talked about it, and we know that her kind are not suitable for employment here." That comment slammed into Keith like a wrecking ball. "Her kind? What kind is she, Dad?" The scowl of disapproval dropped through his father's features. "Oh, you know." "You mean that she was a foster kid? That she was bounced around all over the state because every place she went sucked? Is that what you mean by her kind?" "Look, Keith, I'm sure—" "No." He held up his index finger. "Dad, for once, you are going to listen to me." Hard determination solidified in his chest. "Now, She's been through hell and back, through no fault of her own. Do you know why she was in the foster care system? Do you?" There was a grunt, but no real reply. "I'll tell you why. Because her parents were killed in a car accident, that's why. A car accident, Dad. She was 8 years old, and she was thrown out of the only world she'd ever known and sent first to one house and then to another, not because she was a bad kid, but because they were temporary solutions to a permanent problem. Look, that's really tragic, Keith." "Tragic?" Sanity began to tilt sideways. "Dad, she didn't lose one parent. She lost both of them. Zap, they were gone, just like that." "Like I said, it's tragic." Frustration catapulted him from the chair. "Cripes, Dad, you don't get it, do you?" He paced over to the wall, and his hand raked across his head. "You don't get what something like that does to a kid, and you never have." He spun on the emotions. "It changes you. Way down inside, it changes you in ways you can't even explain. But it's deep, and it's forever. Keith. And it doesn't go away even if you want it to, even if you wish it to, even if you pray to God to take it away. It doesn't go away. Even if you work hard, if you go to college and get a degree, it's still there. It's there even if you get successful and make $1 bazillion. It still doesn't go away. It's right here." He put his hand, little finger edged into the center of his chest. The breaths were coming in hard, fast gulps of air. "Every time you dare to look, it's right there. I know, because I have lived with that pain for the last 17 years. Not that you've noticed." His father's gaze dropped to the desk. "And now? You're going to fire her and tell her she's no good, that she's not worthy of this job, just like she hasn't been worth keeping at any place she's been till now? Is that what you would want someone to do to me, Dad? Huh? Is it? Well, let me tell you something. You do that to her, and you are doing it to me." He let his eyes fall closed to corral the emotions because they were starting to jab into him with such force he couldn't control them. When he opened his eyes, it was not her pain, but her caring that he saw. "Besides, Dad, you should see her with Pete and Izzy. They love her. They really do. I've seen it. They trust her, and even you have to admit there hasn't been a single other one they've trusted so far, not to even mention loved." He took a long, calming breath. "So, if you have the nerve to fire her, the minute she walks out that door, you've just trashed whatever family you have left. Those 2 kids will never be the same, and I'll never be able to have any respect for you again." The words hung in the air, and finally Keith knew he could do no more. "Well, I've said what I came to say." He swiped his hat and bandana off the little table and turned to walk out. The door was open before his father said anything. "Keith, wait." He stopped, but he didn't turn. "Look, I know I made some mistakes with you. I know that. I admit that. I should have been there when your mom, well, she was a wonderful woman. When I lost her—" The words stopped. "I'll talk to Vivian. We should at least give Miss Montgomery a chance." He wanted more, so much more, but at this point, skirting an outright firing was a step in the right direction. Slowly he turned, and the thought went through him that he had never seen that look on his father's face. She deserves that much. All day, Maggie expected that at any moment someone would walk in the room and expel her permanently. However, karate came and went, lunch came and went, naps, playtime. Each slid by as if the guillotine wasn't hanging over her neck. By dinner, she was careful to have both children in their best clothes, standing in the anteroom to the dining room at 10 until 6. It would have been far less intimidating if she had thought that maybe Keith would be by to eat with them. Of course, that was completely impossible. For reasons she couldn't adequately explain, he did his best to remain as scarce as possible when the others were around. It was only at that moment that she wondered about that. She hadn't seen him all day, save for the few minutes welcoming the Ayers back. Of course, it was for the best. He was engaged, not to mention everything else. It was better if he went on with his life and she went on with hers. All she had to do now was convince her heart of that. "Well, well, this is a surprise," Patty Ann said as she strode over to them to inspect the children. "Did you reset your watch to on time?" Maggie absorbed the barb. "No, ma'am. We just had a little practice at getting it right while you were gone. Trust me, it's well in hand now." "Well." The word was more of a grunt of disapproval. The inspection grated across Maggie's nerves. They didn't deserve to be treated like show animals. "May we go in now before you make us late?" Patty Ann's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Don't patronize me, Miss Montgomery. I could have you fired like that if I so choose." "Really? It must be nice to have so much power. Too bad you don't know how to use it to make life better for anyone." "Patty Ann, are the children here yet?" Mrs. Ayer called from inside the dining room. Without waiting for the secretary to make her customary premiere entrance, Maggie pushed the door open and guided the children in. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Ayer. Patty Ann was a little late getting down to make her inspections. I'm sure it won't happen again. Right, Patty Ann?" The two gazes at the table went to the secretary. "No, ma'am," Patty Ann said, with hate dripping from the statement. "It won't happen again." "Here, Peter, give your mommy a kiss," Maggie said, tramping through all the other emotions to get to genuine love for the children. Peter gave Vivian a kiss and then reached his little hands out to the sides for a hug. Taken aback, Vivian glanced up at Maggie. Then she bent and gave him a hug. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "You been back up to the mansion?" Ike asked Friday afternoon when Keith was in the stable office filling out the feeding schedules. "No. Why?" It killed him to say it. In fact, there wasn't a single moment since he'd walked away that he hadn't thought about her, wondered about her, wanted to talk to her to see how things were going. He had stopped Jeffrey for the 411 the day before when the gardener was working on the guest house lawn, Keith's lawn from now until June 3rd. From Jeffrey's account, nothing had changed, no major firings or personnel confrontations, and Keith was pretty sure Jeffrey was tapped into the Inez connection, so he would have known if something major had gone down. Head down, Keith wrote as if nothing in life was more important. "I guess you'll be off this weekend?" Ike asked, although there was more to the question than he let on. "Yeah, I told you that 6 weeks ago, remember? Tanner's coming up early. He'll fill in. If you need more help, you can always call John." "So, everything's cool in paradise, then?" Ike asked, digging still. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" Ike's gaze burrowed into Keith, trying to discern if there was more he wasn't saying. "Oh," Keith said, as if he'd just remembered something. "And I won't be here at all tomorrow. I'm picking Dallas and her folks up at the airport." How he could get all the way to nonchalance, Keith couldn't tell, but he was doing a pretty good job of sounding nearly together about the whole situation. "Well, I'm glad." Ike crossed his arms and leaned on the filing cabinet. "Dallas is a wonderful girl." "Hey," Keith looked up with a smile. "You don't have to sell me on Dallas. I'm marrying her, remember?" Ike looked pleased with that answer. "I'm glad. I was a little worried there for a while." "Worried?" Keith smiled. "No worries, man. This is the happiest time of my life." He grabbed his keys from the shelf. "Gotta go. I'm meeting Greg for drinks." "Greg? Uh-oh. Not too heavy on the uptake there." "Me?" Keith flashed him a grin. "I'm a good boy." Yeah, that's what they all say. Ike became very serious. Take it easy, okay? You've got a lot to get done tomorrow. Keith held up his hands. I'll be good, I promise.
Everything's ready for tomorrow, Vivian said as they sat at dinner Friday night. The governor's office called. He and his wife will be here.
Maggie's fork slowed in her hand. The governor? They didn't mess around.
We may have an issue with the press. Patty Ann has security lined up to keep them outside the gates, but you know they always come up with some sneaky plan to get in where they aren't wanted.
She glanced at Maggie, but quickly returned her gaze to her husband.
We've got florists, caterers, and the photographer. I think everyone's lined up.
Good, Mr. Ayer said. Lowell is expecting this to be a great photo op. It may even have national legs, so they're pumping it that way. The wedding definitely will be, and he may even get a little mileage out of the engagement.
The roast stuck in Maggie's throat. Very softly, she cleared her throat and turned to fuss with Isabella, who had been eating mashed potatoes with her fists.
Oh, baby girl, no, don't do that.
The children will need to make an appearance, Vivian said, and Maggie froze.
The children, ma'am?
Yes, we'd like to have them in the garden for pictures and such, but please keep them from making any scene. We can't have that with a governor here.
Oh, of course not, ma'am. The responsibility wrapped around her, squeezing the breath from her lungs.
Patty Ann has the next 24 hours planned down to the minute, and I expect that everything should go off perfectly.
Maggie didn't answer, as the statement wasn't meant for her, but her heart hurt. It all sounded so scripted. She wondered if Patty Ann had scheduled each kiss, too. Then she snapped that thought in half. How she would ever make it through watching Keith kiss someone else was completely beyond her. Isabella picked that moment to overturn her milk. In the next instant, Maggie was on her feet, mopping up the white substance.
I'm sorry, ma'am. We'll just go and let you all finish. She pulled Peter up. Give your mom a kiss.
He did as instructed, and then, with his hand firmly in hers, and Isabella planted on her hip, they escaped the suffocating atmosphere of the dining room. If they never had to go back, it would be too soon. Well, it's about time, Greg said when Keith made it to the table at Tony's 30 minutes late, and not happy about anything in life. He wasn't in the best of moods, and it was getting worse by the second. Sorry, I lost track of time. That's a bad habit, you know. Greg eyed him. Dallas is going to have to put a leash on you to get you where she wants you on time. Keith didn't want to talk about Dallas. He didn't want to talk about the party, or the mansion, or the next 2 months. Tonight, he had one goal in mind: forgetting everything. Man, dude, go easy on that stuff, Greg said, when they had been firmly ensconced at Billy Joe's dance hall and bar for 5 hours. His wire-framed glasses set off his preppy look like a picture frame. You got a big day tomorrow. Passing out tonight ain't the best idea in the world. Keith turned alcohol-laden eyes on his friend. What are you, my babysitter? Greg's face fell into concern. What is up with you tonight? I haven't seen you like this since the night your dad got married. Yeah, well, I guess the joy of being married runs in the family. The worry on Greg's face deepened. Did you have a fight with Dallas? No. He took another drink. Well, you're gonna have a fight if she finds out about this. Are you gonna sit there all night and ruin my good time? Or are you gonna try to find you a hot babe to help you drive home? The displeasure on Greg's face didn't leave. The way you look, I'm going to have to drive you home. Oh, yeah, Dad would love that. His body swayed under the weight of the alcohol, which he was adding to by the second. Hey, remember that time in college when you dropped me off and I passed out on the front lawn? Boy, that was a howl, wasn't it? Yeah, a howl. Nothing in Greg's voice said he'd enjoyed that episode. Or hey, how about the prom? Remember when I was with, what's her name? Casey. Yeah, Casey. He looked at Greg. Boy, you're good. His train of thought slid away from him. What was I saying? Oh, yeah, Casey. Dang, now she was fine. He took another drink. I wonder whatever happened to her. She's married, 3 kids, upstate. That surprised Keith. Really? Yes, really. Her mom's a friend of my mom. Keith nodded, although he didn't really care. Greg bent his head to catch a glimpse at his watch. Well, it's about that time, brother. How are we going to get you home and tucked in safe and sound? Ache ripped through him, and Keith bowed forward, trying to withstand the thoughts that were flowing through him in disparate directions. He couldn't catch them, not even one. All he knew was that he hurt so bad he just wanted it to stop. Do you think I'm making a mistake? Considering what you have planned for tomorrow, I think this whole idea was a mistake. No, man. Do you think I'm making a mistake with Dallas? Serious concern crowded over Greg's face. Come on, Keith. Listen to yourself. That's crazy. Dallas is the best catch in the state, and you're going to throw her overboard? Dang, man, what has gotten into you? Nothing. Well, I hope nothing disappears by tomorrow, because Dallas will hang you out to dry if you ditch her now. She's not one to toy with, not to mention her dad. Greg shook his head and Mock shivered. He'll fillet you and serve you with dinner if you hurt Dallas. He set his face. No, you've just got a bad case of cold feet, my friend. It will pass, trust me. Once Dallas gets off that plane and she's in your arms again, you'll forget all about second thoughts. Now, we'd better get you home before it's time to get you to the airport. There were so many other things Keith wanted to talk about, so many other things that were twisting through his brain and his spirit. However, Greg didn't stick around to hear them. Instead, he walked off to find something, or someone, or... Keith lost the thought in the sip he took. He'd gotten on this train the minute he'd taken his dad's advice to make it official with Dallas, and there was no getting off now, unless he found a way to forget or to escape. We're here, sir. Sir? The words wound through Keith's brain, fuzzy and incomprehensible. You have to get out of the car, sir. Car. It was something about a car. Keith pulled himself to upright and dragged himself out of the back seat of the car. Swaying dangerously when he was on his feet, he reached for his wallet. What do I owe you? Your friend already took care of it. The driver looked at him skeptically. You be okay getting in? Keith looked up at the stairs that looked 1,000,000 miles high. Yeah, no problem. And then he was standing by himself, not sure of anything other than that he was home. Holding the railing to keep himself moving, he climbed the steps. At the top, he pitched forward to the door. Key. He pulled his keys from his pocket and tried them, one after another. The second time around the key ring, he realized he must have forgotten to bring the right key. Standing there as the world spun in front of his eyes, he reached over and punched the doorbell. There was no sanity left to tell him not to. Over and over he hit it, hoping someone would rescue him before he really did pass out. The door opened, and oblivious to who was standing there, Keith stumbled forward. Mr. Ayer, Inez said in horror. What in the world? Sorry, I dropped my key. Key? But... Who is it, Inez? His father called from the top of the stairs. It's Keith, sir. It's me, Dad. His voice was coated with a slap-happy grin. Aren't you glad to see me? By the time his dad made it down the last step, happy was the last word that would have described him. Where have you been? Sleeping, he grinned. Where you think I've been? Pure, unadulterated anger poured through his father's face until it was red and puffy with it. Get out! He pointed back for the door as Inez gasped, "Out? Now!" His father turned him around to the door. "You are not welcome here." "But go home, clean yourself up, and by tomorrow morning you'd better look like tonight never happened." At the door, he gave Keith a push which really wasn't necessary. Somehow his hands caught the railing as he stumbled down the stairs. "But, Dad—" "Good night, Keith." And his dad shut the door. On the first sound of the doorbell, Maggie had come full awake. There was always uneasiness about sleeping in the mansion. The kids could wake up, and she wouldn't hear them before someone else did. Someone could come in. She was never really sure why, but she had slept lighter here than at any place she'd ever laid her head. With one swipe, she had her button-down shirt from the day before over her, and at the door she quietly let herself out. There were voices down the hall, and when she heard Mr. Ayer's, she pressed herself into the space next to the wall cabinet. "What is it, Conrad? Who was there?" Vivian asked from next to the staircase. "My idiotic son." "Keith? What's wrong with him?" "He's drunk. Imagine that." He let a string of cuss words follow that statement as Maggie closed her eyes and willed this night to go away. Tears stained her heart and spirit as her thoughts went to him. Vivian sounded almost as panicked as Maggie felt. "Did he leave?" "Leave? I threw his butt out." Mr. Ayer muttered a few more choice words. "He's enough of a headache when he's stone-cold sober." No, this night hadn't been good from minute one, and it was getting worse. "What about tomorrow?" Vivian asked with fear. "Well, I would tell you to ask him, but I don't think he could tell you his birth date, much less anything really important right now." "But the Hendersons, he's supposed to pick them up at 1. And what about Dallas? She can't see him like that. It will ruin everything." "You don't think I know that?" The low rumble of a guttural growl filled the expanse of space. "I knew it. I knew he would find a way to mess this up, pulling something like this tonight, of all nights. The only way this could be worse is if he had done it tomorrow night." "Oh, don't even say that." "As important as this is, there was no way he was going to not screw it up." Vivian sighed. "Maybe he'll be better by morning." "Yeah, and maybe the sun will rise in the west." Their voices trailed off down the hallway, and Maggie stood, fixed in place. He was out there, by himself, hurting, and it was knifing into her spirit that his father didn't care more than how that affected his political connections. It was the craziest thing she had ever even considered in her life, but her heart wouldn't let her go back to bed. If they caught her, she would be out. But if she didn't go, she would never be able to live with herself. Quietly, she eased to Isabella's door and peered inside, sleeping as usual. Then she opened Peter's. How they could sleep through the racket of the doorbell, she had no idea, but she was grateful they had. When Peter's door was closed, Maggie took a moment to close her eyes. "God, help. This is crazy, but I can't leave him out there, not like that." On cat feet, she went down the kitchen stairs. The door just off the side of the kitchen was her best bet. It would let her right out near the trail. Then she could go up front and see if he was still there. There wasn't even a squeak as she let herself out. It took more than a moment for her eyes to adjust to the darkness. It was, after all, nearly 3 in the morning. Praying for each footfall, she pushed through the trees to the trail and met Keith's stumbling descent full on. "Keith." "What? Huh?" He barely got stopped, and even when he did, he was still swaying. "It's me, Maggie." She took one look at him and knew it was bad. He was wasted, but more than that, his eyes were stained with tears and falling closed with each word he managed to slur out. "Maggie, what are you doing out here?" "Well, I would ask you the same question, except I think I know. You need help getting home?" He laughed. "Oh, you know me. I don't have a home. I'm just traveling through.
Through, huh? Well, you want some company while you travel? He looked at her with sad, sullen eyes.
Why are you being nice to me? You should be back in there with the rest of them.
We're friends, remember? She wished with everything in her that she knew Ike's number. He would know what to do. He would know how to get Keith somewhere safe. But she didn't know Ike's number, so she said a prayer that her best would be good enough. So, which way is your place?
That way.
He pointed an unsteady finger down the trail.
The guest house. Isn't that what they call it? Yeah, the guest house.
He laughed.
Funny, how long have I been a guest here? You'd think they'd have started calling it Keith's place by now. But then, that would mean they wanted me to stay, which of course they don't.
Maggie sucked in a long breath. So, he wasn't doing work at the guest house that first day. Well, that was about par for how smart she had been about everything else. Come on, let's get you home. It had been the longest walk of her life. All the way, Keith kept asking why she was being so nice and telling her how he didn't have a home and how he should have known his father would yell. He was one of the most pathetic individuals she had ever seen, and the others in the running she really didn't want to think about. The only good thing was he had actually managed to stay on his feet the whole way, which was a blessing considering she couldn't have dragged him 2 inches if she had to. At the guest house, he reached under the front flower pot and produced the key. By now, her body temperature had dropped to below freezing, and she stood on his front porch hopping from foot to stay warm. The door finally gave, and mercifully, he stepped in. She followed him right to the living room, where he fell onto the couch, landing with one leg still trailing behind him. He was home. He was safe. This was none of her business. She tried to tell herself just to leave. She had done more than she should have. Still, if she just left, tomorrow could ruin his life for good. Not that he didn't deserve it after this little stunt, but still, she didn't want to see his life ruined as hers had been by a night out partying. That was too much responsibility to put on any night. She went into the kitchen, found the phone and the little list of numbers taped to the cabinet. There was only one she recognized. It took a long breath to get herself calm enough to dial the number, and it took another one not to hang up. Finally, thankfully, someone picked up. Hello? He was asleep, and Maggie's courage nearly failed her again. Ike?
Yeah?
This is Maggie. Listen, Keith's in trouble. Chapter 9.
Okay, that's it, Keith. Get up. You had your fun. It's time to get going.
Ike didn't sound happy. In fact, Ike didn't sound like Ike. He sounded more like Keith's father than he ever had.
What?
With a yank, Ike spun him off the couch, and Keith landed on the floor with a gut-wrenching thump.
Oh.
Pain, punctuated by nausea, swirled around his head.
What happened? You had a fight with a bottle, and by the looks of it, the bottle won. Now you've got 2 hours to get yourself together enough to look presentable, and by the looks of things, that ain't gonna be easy to pull off. You want eggs, or just coffee?
Keith was struggling to piece the night together. He leaned his head forward and scratched the side of it.
How did I get home? Well, apparently after an unscheduled stop at the mansion, your little friend stupidly brought you here. If it had been me, I'd have left your butt wherever you fell.
The mansion? He searched his memory, but it wasn't there. Then his mind stumbled on the next part of the story. Maggie?
Yes, Maggie. She's way too nice for her own good. Let's just hope it wasn't for nothing, and she still has a job this morning.
Ike came out of the kitchen.
Now, are you just going to sit there, or am I going to have to get out my hot shot?
Activity. It was the only accurate word to describe the chaos Maggie woke up to the next morning. 2 trucks of flowers had pulled up just as she was coming down the stairs with the kids. 4 workers and their supervisor descended on the place, Patty Ann directing them all. "That goes out back. That one stays here on this table."
"Patty Ann, what time is the caterer supposed to be here?" Vivian called from the top step.
1, ma'am.
"And what time are the Hendersons scheduled?"
6:15, ma'am.
Patty Ann didn't even have to glance at the checklist to answer the questions, even as she pointed out where each arrangement went.
"Outside. Miss Montgomery, may I have a word?"
Great. This couldn't be good. "Sure. What's up?"
This probably goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway in case you are not attuned to such matters. These 2 are not to be in the yard today for any reason. We have a lot of very important preparations for tonight's party, and the last thing we need is 2 little sets of paw prints on everything. And that goes double for tonight. They are to come, be present for the first hour and pictures, and then I want them inside, out of sight, and definitely out of Mrs. Ayer's hair. Any slip—"
Maggie didn't like the reference or the tone, but she was already living dangerously on the edge, so she simply smiled. "Don't worry, Patty Ann. They shall be seen at the appropriate times, but never a peep shall they utter, just like children should be." It was clear Patty Ann surmised she was being made fun of. However, it wasn't clear enough that she could protest.
"Good. Remember that. Your job's riding on it."
The water from the shower felt good. If Keith could stay here forever, he would. With a sigh, he let his thoughts drift through the coming day. In 2 short hours, Dallas would be here. And as Ike was wont to yell at him, he'd better be cleaned and pressed when she stepped off that plane. Worse, it would only be a couple more hours before her parents would be here. Keith leaned his head as far back as it would go under the torrent of water at that thought. The one and only reason Lowell Henderson had consented to this marriage was because there was a large bank account backing it. Big donors had a way of holding sway over candidates' decisions, and Keith's father was a big donor.
"Keith,"
Ike called from the other side of the door, banging it in case Keith hadn't heard the summons.
"What?"
It was more of an angry scream than a question.
"We got 10 minutes to be gone if we're going to get your truck. Get a move on."
Nothing in Keith liked this new side of Ike. Nothing. As soon as breakfast was over, Maggie and the kids disappeared up to the playroom. All lessons for the day had been unceremoniously canceled. That was okay. At least she didn't have to worry about a minute-by-minute schedule. Instead, she went into Peter's closet and laid out one of the new outfits that had shown up when she mentioned to Patty Ann he was growing out of his former wardrobe. Wednesday, they had gone down to violin lessons, and when they returned, there was a whole new wardrobe as if the other had never existed. Maggie hadn't meant a complete overhaul. 1 or 2 new items would have been enough. However, that wasn't how the mansion ran. It was a way of living she was slowly learning she would never understand. When she'd assembled Peter's attire for the evening, she went into Isabella's room and searched through the mountains of pink ruffles. It seemed they were on every piece of clothing the child had. Appropriate outfit in hand, Maggie walked to the window to lay it out on the dressing table. However, her gaze betrayed her, and she looked down into the hubbub below. In a few hours, the party would be going. In a few hours, there would be guests galore. She wondered as she put her head on the window if the guest of honor would in fact show up. She had left just after Ike got there the night before, and she hadn't heard a single thing from that side of the estate all morning. Although she wasn't sure how, she knew last night did not happen because of fun. He was too downtrodden when she'd caught up with him. She wondered what had made him sad enough to go jumping off the deep end like that. She also wondered who was with him and why on earth they had left him off at the mansion. What friend dropped someone off into that no-win trap? Below the trees, she could make out the people working. Each preparation made was one less thing between her
and tonight. If she could have gotten out of it, she would have. But short of quitting, there didn't seem a good way to do that. No, she would be there with a smile on her face, for him and for her job, and which was the bigger motivation, she wasn't sure. His head still hurt, and it probably wasn't going to quit any time soon. 4 Advil and enough coffee to drown a horse hadn't really helped except to convince Ike that he was serious about the repentance. With everything he had, Keith wanted to jump off the planet for this one day. Be somebody else. Take a train ride to nowhere, hijack the space shuttle, and fly it to Mars. Nonetheless, here he was standing, solid and smiling, as Dallas walked off the plane. In 1 second, she was walking toward him. In the next, she was in his arms. "Oh, baby, aren't you a sight for sore eyes?" Dallas said, throwing her arms around his neck. The impact nearly sent him tumbling backward, but he caught himself at the last possible second. "Hey, babe, it's great to see you too." When he pulled back, she smiled for half a second, closed her eyes, and pressed her lips to his. It had been so long since he'd kissed her, Keith was taken off guard as much by the suddenness as by the ardor. It seemed not to matter to her at all that they were in public with 1,000 people milling about around them. For the first instant, he stiffened, and then rational kicked in, and he pulled her into his arms. The kiss was passionate as so many of their kisses had been. Truth was, Dallas had never lacked in that area. When the kiss broke, her gaze found his. Man, it is good to be home. In her white silk shirt with a black stripe hugging her chest, Dallas resembled every other co-ed home for the early April break. Her white blonde hair was swept back, and only a few bangs were released to slide down across her forehead. Creamy white skin, perfect complexion, crystal clear blue eyes. She was picture-perfect from head to toe. Even her jeans were graciously ripped in all the right places. "So, are you happy to see me?" "Of course. How was the trip?" He took her hand in his between them, but she hung on to his arm as well. "Oh, horrific as usual. Bad food, long lines, smelly seats. I'm just glad to be down on the ground with you." She tightened her grip on him, which would have been more of a hug except they were walking side by side through the airport. No matter, she laid her head on his shoulder. "I am so excited about tonight. I can't stand it." Keith said nothing, knowing it wasn't necessary. "We are supposed to drop Mom and Dad off at the Crowne Plaza on the way in. They decided to get the limo to take them to the mansion." "Oh, okay." He was walking, talking as if his head and heart weren't killing him. "Dad said they may even stay for brunch tomorrow if your Mom and Dad can swing it. In the city, of course. Dad has to get back to Washington early tomorrow. They're voting on the Taylor-Radkin bill Monday. He can't miss that." "No, of course not." Keith fought to find something else to talk about. Something normal people would talk about. "I guess you checked your stuff?" "Yeah, if you're going to check one thing, you might as well check them all these days. It's such a hassle. Just getting through security is like, ugh." His smile was almost real. "Well, you're here. That's all that matters." She pulled him to her again and kissed him sideways. "Have I told you lately how much I love you?" Something resembling happiness drifted over him. "I don't think so. Why don't you remind me?" On the down escalator, she stood one step above him. Gently, she ran her hand under his chin, tilting it up so she could bring her lips to his. When the kiss broke, she smiled at him devilishly. It's too bad we have to get Mom and Dad. I'd love to go back to your place and get reacquainted." Keith nearly tripped getting off the escalator. She certainly didn't waste any time. He scratched the back of his neck as he caught the knowing smile of the woman descending behind them. "Well, that's going to have to wait. We have a party to host tonight, if you didn't remember." "I remember just fine." She held out her hand that sported the iridescent rock Keith had given her
on the all-night private cruise they had taken when he'd popped the question. The cruise was a little over the top for Keith, but his dad had said with a proposal like that, she couldn't say no. And, as always, his dad was right. Dallas liked to be wined and dined, the best restaurants, the finest of everything. It had been abundantly clear from the start that she was enamored with his place in the world and what that place could offer her. "Oh, I was looking on the internet the other day, and I found a great place over in the Woodlands we've got to check out while I'm here. It's not too big, 4 bedrooms, 3 baths. It's got a swimming pool and a garden." His life began to coil around his chest, squeezing so tightly Keith thought he might either pass out or be sick right there. He forced a smile to stave off running. "Really? It sounds nice." "And I heard from Hayden and Elliot Thursday. I can start July 1st, even if I don't have my official license yet. They'll just put me under one of their junior partners until my results come in." "Great." By now, they were standing at the carousel, her still draped on him from shoulder to foot. "Have you thought more about what we talked about? You know, applying at Devonshire. Daddy said it would be a great first step for you, what with the horse thing and all." "The horse thing," he said under his breath. Then he brought himself to a stop. "I haven't really had time." He scratched the back of his head, which felt very different without his usual headgear. "We've been really busy getting the horses ready for Grand Prairie." "Oh." That stopped her for about 2 seconds. Then she shook her head back. "Well, have they won anything this year?" "We got 3rd in Grand Prairie. Ike's going to Del Mar." The carousel picked that moment to turn on. Her attention snapped to it. "Oh, good. Maybe we can grab my stuff and go somewhere decent to eat before Mom and Dad get in." Dallas checked her watch. "What's close out here?" The turn in conversation, coupled with his unbelievable headache, spun the question around in Keith's head. I don't know, really." Suitcases started kathunking down the silver spiral. "Mine are black, Salvatore Ferragamo." Like he could tell the difference. It took 15 bags before she noticed one of hers. He pulled that one off. "There are 5, she said, but she was so intent on the others coming off, she didn't see the skepticism in his face, nor the shake of his head. From his vantage point, high maintenance should have been stamped on her business card. "Dad, Mom." Dallas leaned in to give her mom a side cheek kiss. "How was your flight?" "Ugh, stressful," her mother Beatrice said in frustration. "Next time we are definitely taking the speaker up on his offer." "What offer is that?" Dallas asked. "He's Texan. We're Texan. His private jet knows the way with no reprogramming," Beatrice said, reveling in the attention of the horribleness of having to fly with regular people. "It's nice to see you, Mrs. Henderson," Keith said, extending his hand. "And you, Mr. Henderson. I'm glad you made it safely." "Have we heard anything official from the governor yet?" Mr. Henderson, a white-haired, distinguished, but pompous man, asked as he pulled himself up to his full 6 feet. Not yet, sir." Keith stumbled through the minefield in the man's eyes. "At least we hadn't when I left, but that was a couple of hours ago." He checked his watch for emphasis, but the thought of what happened in 4.5 hours made him pull in the stale air around him. Exhaling slowly, he forced those thoughts from his mind. "We'd better get going. Midday traffic can get a little nuts on the weekends."
"Patty Ann, are they here yet?" Vivian yelled from the top of the stairs.
In the hallway leading to the kids' wing, Maggie's attention snapped that direction. Isabella was down for a nap. Peter was trying to take one too. However, with all the commotion, him actually sleeping was a long shot. "No, ma'am, I haven't seen them."
"Well, call Keith's cell phone. Find out where they are."
"Yes, ma'am." As stupid as it was, Maggie wondered if something major was keeping them. She had clearly noted on the schedule Patty Ann had issued at noon that Keith and Dallas were due back on the estate by 3:30. It was now sliding toward 4. Maybe they'd had a wreck, or maybe someone's plane had been delayed or irrevocably detained. Maybe there was emergency legislation pending in the Senate. Or maybe Dallas forgot all about the weekend and took off for Barbados. "Not to worry," Patty Ann said as she came up the stairs. "They are at the guest house. Miss Dallas is getting settled in. They will be here at 5:30.
"Oh, that's a relief," Vivian said with a sigh. Maybe to her. "I always forget how provincially bachelors live," Dallas said, lounging on the beige-toned sofa. "Just wait. A woman's touch will make all the difference." Keith brought in 2 glasses of tea from the kitchen. "Lightly sweetened," he said, handing her the glass. She took a sip, her gaze staying on him as he sat on the couch next to her. "You know," she said as she set the glass on the glass-topped coffee table, "I was hoping I'd get more than a little tea once we got here." With a motion he knew he should remember, she swung herself over closer to him. "We've got an hour before we have to be anywhere. You have any idea how we can fill that much time?" Her kiss, once his most prized goal, was demanding and insistent. She pressed herself into him even as he fought the instinct to back away. With both hands, he took her shoulders and pulled her from him. "Hey, Tiger. Whoa there. Patty Ann is going to come down here and skin us both alive if we're late." "Let her. It's our party. We can be late if we want to."
She came at him again, but Keith managed to stop her progress. "And your parents won't be happy if we aren't there to meet them, not to mention my parents," the thought of which stabbed a knife of guilt and fear right into him. However, at the moment he was facing down one situation, and at this point, one at a time was all he could manage. Besides, that will make tonight so much better. He smiled slyly at her. "Surely you can wait a few more hours." She spun petulantly and crossed her arms. "Well, yeah, but you'd better make this worth it." It hurt to smile. "You know it."
Chapter 10.
"Don't even think about it," Patty Ann said from behind Maggie as she retied Peter's shoe in the upstairs hallway. That shoe was forever coming untied. What she would have given for his old ones. At least they'd stayed tied. "About what?" Maggie asked, turning and tying simultaneously. She was bent down on the ground, and with Patty Ann behind her, there was a distinct possibility of being kicked the rest of the way to the carpet. You look like a high school math teacher on her first day of school." Maggie's eyes widened in incomprehension. Why?" She looked down at herself as she stood. The turquoise and white striped shirt wasn't exactly horrible. Patty Ann walked around her slowly. No. This will never do. Do you not know the governor is going to be here along with some other very important people? We can't have you walking around as if you just stepped out of the Walmart parking lot." The jab hurt, even from Patty Ann. Maggie looked down at her attire once more. "It's not like I'm the guest of honor. No one's even going to see me." "You represent this family." Every word exploded like a bomb. "Never, ever take that for granted. The way you look reflects on their standing in society. It is not acceptable for you to go around looking like the help." "Hello, I am the help." "Pfft." Patty Ann held up her hand. She scrutinized Maggie carefully. "I hate to even ask this, but don't you have anything better? Anything?" The small list of clothing slid through her mind. "I have a pink top that's kind of silk-looking, but except this skirt, I don't really have anything to go with it." Patty Ann considered that. "What size do you wear?" 8. The word was at least 6 syllables long. Why? A moment of consideration, and the decision was made. "I'll be right back." The entrances were scripted to perfection. The Ayers first as hosts, the governor and his wife as honored guests, the Hendersons as parents of the bride-to-be. And then last, but not least, the happy couple. His father had even sent the limo down the driveway to the guest house to get them. It seemed this side of ridiculous for them to actually travel outside the gate to a discreet turnaround and then come back. But when it was in the schedule, questions just got in the way. "Oh, look, here they are," Vivian called to the assembled guests when Keith and Dallas walked arm in arm into the lavishly decorated backyard. Applause broke out around them. The backyard looked like a garden had exploded. White and pink flowers were everywhere. Soft candles burned in various places, although the hot Texas sun was doing no bowing to its puny counterparts. As he stepped with Dallas into the sea of faces he hardly recognized, Keith smiled as if this was the only place in the world he'd ever wanted to be. Somehow, he hadn't seen this part when he'd asked her to marry him. Somehow, the thought of flashbulbs and formal greetings hadn't entered his mind.
"Son, Keith," his father said, puffing himself out with pride, "may I introduce you to Governor Keyes?"
"Governor." Keith shook the man's hand like an expert.
"Mrs. Keyes, this is Dallas Henderson, my fiancé."
The last word lodged in his throat, but with a push, he got it out.
"It's so nice of you to come. We so appreciate it."
From her post in the corner next to the outside wall, Maggie watched him. He was hard not to watch. Smoke-colored tailored pants, white shirt casually buttoned. He looked the part of the handsome billionaire heir. The problem was he didn't look at all like Keith. Dallas, on the other hand, looked like she belonged nowhere else. Something in Maggie had hoped that Dallas wasn't all that pretty, because at least then Keith's assessment that she was nice would have been balanced by the fact that she wasn't also beautiful. Well, that worked. No, Dallas wasn't pretty. She was gorgeous. Her dress, a white number that plunged deep and rose high, accentuated a figure that said it was made for that kind of dress. The light golden hair was pulled to the side in a loose ponytail that hung over her left shoulder, wisps of hair sliding off both sides. Worse, her necklace and earrings alone had to cost more than Maggie would make in her lifetime. Yes, Dallas Henderson was beautiful, and the fact that she was nice, too, completely torpedoed any outlandish hopes Maggie had managed to put together about her chances with Keith. Even though her stomach twisted in knots at the sight, she watched them, mingling and sipping champagne, his arm around Dallas as if it belonged nowhere else. Her attention returned to Peter and his sister, making sure they didn't go far. That wasn't too much of a problem because Peter seemed to be permanently attached to the silk pants Patty Ann had loaned her. They felt great, but they probably cost more than all her other purchases put together. Worse, it wasn't totally clear where they had come from. "Guard them with your life" was not what you wanted to hear when you'd be on the front lines with 2 children. So, with no better options, Maggie resorted to sitting on the little bench that had been added along with who knew how many other things to the backyard. It was like a completely different place. They'd even moved the playhouse, which must have taken more than a little effort. She sighed as she looked around. Here she was, in the midst of the Texas elite, and even though she was physically here, she was, for all intents and purposes, completely invisible. It hadn't taken Keith more than 5 minutes to locate Maggie. From the first second he caught sight of her over in the corner by the miniature yellow rose-covered trellis, he'd wanted nothing more than to find a way to break away from the stuffed shirts and thank her for her kindness the night before. However, he knew that wouldn't be possible tonight as much as he wanted it to be. Too many people were watching his every move. Besides, tonight was about showing off for his father and Dallas's family. He felt like a trophy on a shelf having been taken down for others to ooh and ah over. Still, his gaze betrayed him every so often and drifted where the rest of him wanted so badly to go. "Well, Dallas, I'm glad to see Keith found you back," Ike said with a big Texas grin as he ambled up to the happy couple.
"Ike, I'm so glad you could come."
She put her arms around him and leaned forward. Keith wondered how her dress stayed on. The top of it was held together with a couple of gold chains which plunged down the backless part of the dress to the waistline. When she pulled back, Keith held out his hand. "Ike?" "Keith." Warnings and an ultra-critical evaluation of the situation flowed through Ike's eyes and smile right into Keith, pulling guilt out in fistfuls. Then, with a real smile at Dallas, Ike raised his glass. "Congratulations, you two. I hope you will be very happy together." As Ike stepped away, Keith closed his eyes for the barest of moments. When he opened them again, his gaze snagged on the young lady with the white pants and modest pink blouse sitting in the corner of the yard with 2 little children. Her hair was pulled up in that way that let it cascade down her back, conservative, and yet not stuffy. Next to her sat Peter, and on her lap sat Isabella. She was playing with them, talking to them, just like she always did. If he could just go over. "I'd like a picture with a happy couple," the governor said to those standing around. "Philip?" The governor's photographer stepped up. The 2 couples smiled, and the picture was recorded for all of posterity. "Well, well, it's good to see you standing on your own power," Greg said an hour later as Keith stood at the tree, taking a breather from the socializing. He was about full up and overflowing on his small talk quotient for the year. Keith held out his hand to his friend. "You made it." "Yes, I did. Even more remarkably, you did." Greg shook Keith's hand. Then, sipping the champagne, he leaned on the tree next to Keith. "So, you made it to the airport looking all happy and chipper, I guess?" "No thanks to you." "Me?" Greg sounded genuinely surprised. "What did I do?" "Next time you call a cab, tell them which house is mine, if you don't mind." "I did." "No, you didn't. You sent them to the mansion. Big difference." Anger snapped into Keith. "Thanks to you, my dad hasn't spoken to me all day." Greg shrugged that off. "Hey now, that's not my fault. It was all I could do to convince you not to be a total idiot and try to drive home. Because of me, you're standing there in one piece. You should be thanking me." They stood in the silence of a skirmish neither wanted to continue at the moment. "So, what's the story on Peter's new friend?" Greg asked, lifting his chin toward Maggie and the children who were still in the corner, at the party, and yet not really visible. "The new nanny." Keith took a sip of champagne to keep his heart from cracking in 2. "Does the new nanny have a name?" "Maggie. Maggie Montgomery." The name slid through him, knifing into his heart with a complete understanding that whatever he wanted with her would never become his reality. He looked around at the party. No, his reality was about his father's money and his position in this life. Anything more substantial was a dream that would never be any more than that. "Hello there," the tall, dark-haired, good-looking guy with the little wire-framed glasses said as he stood next to the bench where Maggie sat. "Hi." "Cute kids." "Thanks." Somehow, she had thought spending the whole night in the corner alone could get no worse. She was wrong. "They're the Ayer kids, right?" That pulled Maggie's uneasiness to the surface. "I'm sorry, who are you again?" "Oh, sorry." He sat down and pulled his dark blue jacket with him, which to Maggie was not an improvement. "Greg Parker, I'm Keith's friend." He held out his hand to her. The name pulled up 1,000 emotions she was trying desperately to bury. "Oh, it's nice to meet you, Greg, Keith's friend." Isabella was toddling around the bench, and just as she got to Maggie's leg, she reached out, but missed, landing on her bottom. "Oops, baby girl, try it again." Maggie lifted her to her feet as Greg's hand fell back to his jacket.
Kiki!
Isabella said, her eyes shining. Maggie's attention dropped to the little face she had grown to so love.
Kiki? Is that Maggie?
Kiki!
Isabella pounded Maggie's knee with her hand. Greg smiled. You're good with her. It's my job. Yeah, Keith told me you're the new babysitter. Nanny. What's the difference? A babysitter goes home when the parents get back from wherever they were. A nanny, well... She snagged Isabella from escaping too far and swung her onto her lap. Come here, you. So, you don't get, time off or anything? He took a sip of champagne, although he never really took his gaze off of her. Nope, not so far. His face fell. Isn't that like slave labor? Don't they have to give you some time off? Maggie shrugged. I don't mind. What else do I have to do, right? Ms. Montgomery, Patty Ann said, stepping up beside them. From her outfit, any normal person would have assumed she was the bride's mother at a wedding. Ivory Chanel suit, upswept hair. It was a little much for a garden party. Yes, ma'am. Maggie stood, picking Isabella up with her. She felt Greg rise at her side, and she wondered about that. Mrs. Ayer is ready for the formal pictures to be taken, so the children are needed. Oh, of course. Maggie glanced back at Greg. Excuse me. She was there for the pictures, of that much Keith was 100% sure. What he was less sure of was where she had gone after the pictures. As the sun relinquished its hold on the party and the soft lights came up, Keith couldn't help but glance back at the empty corner. Frustration poured through him when even after minutes and minutes she didn't reappear there. He checked his watch and realized she must be putting Pete and Izzy down for the night. His gaze traveled up to Isabella's window, and, sure enough, the soft light in her window was on. At that moment, he would have given everything he would ever own to ditch all of this and go up there to help her tuck the kids in. The light in the window faded to black, and he didn't even have to try to remember the soft prayers she would say as she bent over Peter's bed. You're not getting tired already now, are you? Dallas waltzed up and draped her arms over his shoulders. Just taking a breather. She leaned over to him and nuzzled his ear. Self-consciousness dropped over him. Hey, you're pressing your luck there. He ran his hand over her back. I haven't forgotten what you like, she said, pulling her bottom lip under her teeth. She looked back at the party. Do you think anyone would miss us? At that moment, Keith caught sight of his father across the grass, standing and talking to both the governor and to Mr. Henderson. His father's glance in Keith's direction froze his blood. There was resolve in his gaze and a smile of self-satisfaction underneath. His stance on the situation was clear. Marry her, or else. Hey, you two, get a room, Greg said good-naturedly, as he walked up to where they were huddled. Jealous? Dallas asked, smiling at Greg. Well, I wouldn't be if Keith here would hook me up with a nanny. Dallas tilted her head in curiosity. The nanny? What nanny? Greg lifted his chin to indicate the back corner, and Keith's heart did a nosedive. Somehow, that wasn't what he had expected. Maggie, I'd love to ask her out, but you know the Ayers, they are taskmasters. They're not so bad once you get to know them, Dallas said, turning her full wattage charm in Keith's direction. Yeah, well, tell that to whoever hasn't let Maggie off yet. How long's she been here, anyway? Keith had to swallow to get the answer out. Couple of weeks. That got Dallas's attention. A couple of weeks? And she hasn't had any time off? Keith's shrug hurt for more reasons than he could name. Well, Greg, you leave it to me. Dallas laced her arm through Greg's and bent her head furtively. I'm sure they will take the advice of their future daughter-in-law. Besides, we owe you one for hooking us up. The least we could do is return the favor. Ugh. She had to go and remind Keith. The night he never wanted to remember, the one she would never let him forget. It was a dance at A&M which were always rowdy and way fun. Keith and Greg had gone to scope out the prospects for a night of fun, and Keith spotted Dallas almost instantly. She was a sophomore at the time, and he didn't know her from Eve. During a slow song, he'd finally gotten up the courage to ask her to dance. However, when he approached her to ask, she surveyed him like he was dirt personified. Stupidly, he had asked her anyway, and it was with no small amount of insinuated insult that she had turned him down, making a point to do it loudly in front of her friends. He hated remembering that moment. It always made his heart stop his breathing. But Greg, being the friend he always had been, assured Keith it was only because she didn't know who he was. So Greg took it upon himself to fix the situation, and fix it he did. By the time they left, Dallas was hanging on Keith's every word, and before the next 3 sunsets, they were a couple. "Do you think she'll come back down tonight?" Dallas asked, a little too into this whole setup thing than Keith would have liked. "What, does she, have to put the kids in bed and stuff?" "That's generally in the job description," Keith said, hating how mean he sounded. "Well, maybe we can't do anything tonight," Dallas said as she patted Greg's arm. "But I'm here the whole week. I'm sure we can get something to work out." When the kids were in bed, prayers said and tucked in, Maggie went to her own room. She didn't turn the light on. They might see it from the party. Instead, she knelt down next to her bed as tears of letting go streamed down her face onto the little white flowers. "Dear Lord, I know I never had a chance with Keith. I know that as well as you do. But please, I ask you, keep him safe. Help him to be happy with Dallas. Help them to have a long and happy life together because he deserves that much." The night wound down eventually. The governor and his wife left. The guests left. Even the Hendersons had to call it a night. Keith was running on empty. After the night before, the draining afternoon, and the overtaxing evening, he was about 10 seconds from curling up on one of the little benches and calling a stop time forever. "Well, we really should be going too," Dallas said as she laced her arm through his. "Are you staying at the guest house?" Vivian asked, and Keith wanted to throw up at the obviousness of the question. "Where else?" Dallas asked, as if she was thrilled with the house and everything about it. She shrugged to get closer to him. "Oh, and Mrs. Ayer, Keith and I were thinking about having a little party Monday evening. Nothing big, just a few close friends." This was news to Keith, so he perked up his ears lest he miss something important. "We invited Greg, and he wanted to bring a guest." Vivian's face asked the question as much as she did. "And the problem is?" "Well, it's who he wants to ask," Dallas said, and then she leaned in lest anyone happen to hear. "Maggie Montgomery." Vivian's eyebrows shot up. "The nanny?" Dallas smiled. "You know Greg, never one to shoot very high." The comment raked right over Keith's nerves. "But we were kind of hoping we could help him out. Do you think Maggie could have Monday night off?" Vivian smiled serenely. "I'm sure we could arrange that." Chapter 11. All day Sunday, Keith thought of little other than Maggie. Of course, he had plenty of other things to occupy his mind and his time, like Dallas and her incessant come-ons. He had ducked the issue the night before by practically falling asleep in their limo ride from the mansion to the guest house. It wasn't an act. He was done for. Nonetheless, the barrage of innuendos had started the moment he woke up. Had he not had the brilliant idea of breakfast in bed, talking her out of anything else would have been next to impossible. More to the point, they were to meet his parents at 8 o'clock to ride with them into Houston to meet her parents at 9 o'clock, and the prospect of all the parents, on top of everything else, was making him seriously queasy.
I wonder if Greg called Maggie yet, Dallas said, when she helped Keith take the breakfast dishes back to the kitchen. The statement twisted through his gut. I really hope she says yes. It would be nice for Greg to have someone. Keith turned to her questioningly. Why is this so important to you? Because, she stepped up to him and laid her arms over his shoulders. I want everyone to be as deliriously happy as we are.
Ms. Montgomery, Patty Ann said with her usual amount of iciness, may I have a word with you? Maggie had chosen to keep the kids upstairs rather than running the gauntlet of tempers and exhausted nerves the next morning. She had asked Inez if she could take breakfast up for the kids for a Sunday treat, and despite her assumptions of what the maid would say, permission was granted. Now it seemed she had been caught. She unfolded herself from the floor and walked to the door, pulling her shirt down behind her. Yes, ma'am. Patty Ann stepped into the hallway, and Maggie's uh-oh meter went off the chart. Still, she followed her out with only a quick, "You two be good." Ms. Montgomery, 3 things. First, Mrs. Ayer wanted to extend her appreciation for your job performance last night. The children were there for the appropriate impact at just the right moments, and not seen other than that. Very well done. That surprised Maggie. Thank you. Second of all, here is your paycheck for the first 2 weeks of your service. You will be receiving payment from here on out on the 15th and the 1st. There are no advances, so budget accordingly. Maggie accepted the little envelope. Yes, ma'am. And finally, you are being given tomorrow off. Off? The word smashed into Maggie. Why? So you can go into town and deposit that or do errands or whatever it is you do on a day off. Maggie's thoughts went into the room behind her. What about the kids? Not to worry. They shall be taken care of. Keith, I talked with Lee Farrell of Devonshire Incorporated last week, Mr. Henderson said as they sat around the table eating brunch. He is really interested in talking with you about your future in Houston. Dallas elbowed him and smiled. Oh, really? Keith asked. He cleared his throat because the roll went down the wrong pipe. With your background in your father's company and your degree, Lee thinks you would be a natural to run their Midland assets. Midland? He cleared his throat again. He glanced at Dallas. We had planned to live in Houston. Oh, of course. Running things in Midland doesn't mean you have to live there. He laughed as if it was the most absurd thing he'd ever heard. You'd just have to go out there once or twice a week. Day trips for the most part. How much had Mr. Henderson talked with Mr. Farrell? It sounded like suicide to accept the offer. His father-in-law knowing the everyday details of his job and, presumably, his home life as well? He already had one watchdog. He didn't need 2. Sounds interesting. I was telling Keith yesterday there's a nice little starter place in the Woodlands, Dallas said. It's a perfect distance from Hayden and Elliot. We're going to go look at it this week. Right, honey? She snaked her arm through his, and Keith had to fight not to remove his arm from the encroachment. Well, I can't say how pleased I am with the foundation the 2 of you are building, his father said, and he really did look proud. Years ago, when I started out, it was with a $5 bill and a dream. I can't imagine where I would be now if I had the start you 2 are getting. Dallas beamed her appreciation. We are so lucky. There's a phone call for you in the kitchen, Inez said, standing at the door to the playroom. For as many hours as they had spent with no one seeming to notice they were still on the planet, Maggie wondered why suddenly today everyone seemed to be showing up. "'Kay, I'll be right there." She stood, pulled her top down, and leveled her gaze at Peter. "You be good and take care of your sister, got it?" Peter's eyes widened in fear. "Don't worry," she winked at him. "I trust you." After a moment he smiled and nodded. With that, she went down, wondering who in the world would be calling her. Mrs. Malinowski was the only one she could think of, And that made no sense, because she didn't have the number, which Maggie assumed was unlisted, and unless it was a tragedy, her foster parent would never call anyway. She picked the phone off the cabinet like it was a bomb that might explode. Hello? It was laced with uncertainty. Maggie, oh good, I'm glad I caught you. How a telemarketer had tracked her down here, she would never know. I'm not interested in whatever you're selling. He laughed. No, Maggie, this is Greg, Parker. Remember? From the party last night. Maggie glanced over at Inez, who she was sure was listening. Oh, hi, Greg. If you're looking for Keith? No, I'm not looking for Keith. I'm looking for you. Awkwardness twined through her as she pulled her arm up over her middle. Me? What? Why? Listen, Keith and Dallas are having a little get-together tomorrow night. Nothing fancy, just some old friends. I was wondering if you might want to go with me. The question knocked her backward. Well, please say yes. I know I shouldn't beg, but please say yes. Everybody else is going to be coupled off, and I don't want to go alone. I just broke up with my girlfriend last month, and, well, I haven't had much of a chance to meet anyone new. But I don't want to pressure you. If you don't want to go with me, I'll understand. Ugh, why did he have to sound so nice? Why couldn't she just be a little more cruel, a little more selfish? It would have solved a lot of problems. Please, Maggie, we can go late, leave early. You'll never even have to know I'm in the room. She laughed a little laugh at that. Well, maybe I want to know you're in the room. He seemed to breathe in that statement. Cool. So you'll go with me? Yes, Greg, I'll go with you. Tomorrow, I'm going to need to run into Houston for a while, Dallas said as Keith's dad and Vivian monitored the conversation from the other side of the limo on their way back to the estate. I need to get a few things for the party, and several things for your place. She angled her attention to his parents. Bachelors, they live on such a bare minimum. His father laughed. Keith never was one to need much. Tell me about it. His place is positively minimalist. Keith wanted to tell her that he hadn't touched a single decoration nor furnishing in 5 years. Each and every piece was hand-picked and put there by Vivian before she knew he would be using the place. However, even at this moment, he couldn't be that cruel. So he accepted the jab and lowered his head to the proper level of embarrassment. So you're having a party tomorrow night? His father asked, smiling at Dallas while he simultaneously glared at Keith. How he could pull that off with them sitting right next to each other, Keith wasn't sure, but he felt it just the same. Dallas shrugged. Just a few friends, nothing big. We'll start with hors d'oeuvres on the patio. I'm thinking pâté with a nice red wine, and then, for the meal, something light. Lamb or duck. I didn't know you were such a chef, Vivian said, clearly impressed with the menu. The limousine rolled into the turn and then through the gate. Oh, no, I'm not. I thought either we could have it catered, or we could just use your staff. Keith noticed Vivian nearly swallow her teeth, and it was all he could do to keep from laughing. Instead, he simply leaned over to Dallas and kissed her cheek. Whatever you want, baby. I'll be there by 6:30. Instantly, the color drained from Dallas's face. 6:30? Where are you going to be? Working, of course. We've got to get Dragnet ready for Oak Tree. Isn't that right, Dad? Humph. It wasn't really an answer at all, but Keith liked the sound of his father's awkwardness just the same. Dallas was having trouble putting 2 words together. Vivian was clearly holding back a fit of anxiety, and his father was puffed and as red as a lobster. Well, his father finally managed, I will be going into Houston tomorrow, and then up to Amarillo Tuesday for meetings. Amarillo? Vivian asked, her world spinning around her. You didn't tell me that. I've been busy with other things. The car pulled up to the mansion and stopped. If he hadn't known better, Keith would have sworn his father and Vivian were racing to get out. However, Dallas never so much as moved. He looked at her. Ladies first. Her eyes widened. "We're getting out here? Why can't they take us to the guest house?" "It's only a half-a-mile walk," Keith said, teasing her. "What, are you afraid you're going to melt?" She didn't look happy. In fact, she looked downright mad. No, but she got out anyway. On the trail, Keith tried to take her hand, but she anchored her arms over her middle. He didn't fight it. After all, that's what he'd wanted for 24 hours, for her to stop hanging all over him. He put his hand in his pocket and absorbed the beauty of the day. The trees rustled above them, bringing him back to center. "So, what do you think about riding out to the falls on Wednesday? I think I should be able to get the afternoon off." "The falls?" she asked, and there was a note of panic. "On horses?" "Well, yeah. I mean, we could take the Dodge, but the horses let us take the slow way." For as much as Dallas had hinted around the subject of being with him in the last day, she suddenly looked pale at the prospect. "Isn't it kind of hot to be riding?" "You think it's hot now? Wait until July." But his own comment knocked the words away from him. July. Everything would be different come July. "Maybe we can go see the house in the Woodlands on Wednesday. Put down an offer. I'd like to get that checked off the list as soon as possible. And Tracy and I are going to go in and finalize everything with the florist on Thursday. I wanted to do a final fitting on my dress before I leave. That would have to be Friday. I don't want to wait until the last minute on that. Mom and Vivian have the guest lists already online, so I'll be putting the invitations together at school. I'd wanted to do it this weekend, but Mom was waiting on a few from her side. It's such a nightmare to get 600 guests in sync for something like this." The thought of 600 guests almost overwhelmed every other thing she had just said. Keith inhaled to stop his thoughts from swimming through all the details. Finally, it struck upon something that had to be taken care of immediately. He rubbed his thumb across the bottom of his nose as the nerves tingled there. "Listen, about tomorrow night. I know the staff at the mansion would be glad to do the party, but I think it would be better if we hired someone on our own." Her face fell. "Why?" He shrugged. "Well, it's our party, and they're not our staff." It took a long minute for that information to wind through her. At the turn for the front door, she shook her head. "It sure is hot out here." "Yeah, it is." Dallas spent most of the evening on the phone with Tracy, making plans for the next day, and Keith spent it getting the place ready for a party. It wasn't that bad, but still, he wanted it nice for Dallas, not to mention the other guests he wasn't even sure were coming. Some deep, demented part of him wanted to call Greg to find out if he'd asked Maggie, but that was playing with fire. He was sure to find out soon enough, and to him, seeing her again couldn't come soon enough. "I think I'm going to turn in," Dallas said when the phone call ended. "I'm supposed to meet Tracy at her place in Houston at 8, which means leaving here at what?" 6:30, Keith said, "if you want to miss at least some of the traffic." Huh. That deflated her even further. "And you need to call a caterer first thing," he said, infinitely more into the actual details of having a party than she was. "Okay, fine." She slumped into a chair and watched him pull out the vacuum. "Are you going to do that now?" "Unless you want to do it tomorrow. I've got to be at the stables at 8, and I won't be back until at least 6 or 6:30. "But I told everyone to be here at 6:30. "Thus, I'm vacuuming now." He was getting tired of this conversation. "But I wanted to spend some time with you." "What do you call this?" She pursed her lips. "Vacuuming? Come on, Keith. This was supposed to be fun." "Yes, but it can't always be fun. There's work involved, too." With that, he started the vacuum and pushed it over the carpet. Dallas watched him for only a couple of seconds. Then, with a huff, she launched out of the chair and stalked down the hallway. Keith exhaled and rolled his eyes. If he was lucky, she would be asleep before he got the rest cleaned, because one thing was for sure, she wasn't coming back to help. Maggie had meant to be gone before 9. She had to get to the bank and cash her more money than she'd ever seen in her life check. Then she had a little shopping to do. With the white silk pants back to their original owner, and everything from Walmart on its second go-around, she decided to get something nice for tonight. Something that didn't scream poverty. Where she would get this outfit, she had no clue, but that was part of the excitement. The two biggest problems were the kids and her car. When she went to leave, you would have thought someone had died. Both kids looked completely abandoned and then started wailing. She tried to calm them down, but when that didn't work, Inez shooed her away. Reluctantly, she left, not seeing that she had much other choice. Walking down through the trees, Maggie thought about her shoes that first day, and she smiled. 2 sizes too big, just like this job. Still, somehow, it had come to fit her like the new white tennis shoes on her feet. Her thoughts stumbled back to Walmart, and a shopping cart, and him. Sad acceptance slid through her. They were good together, Keith and Dallas. That much was obvious. As much as that hurt, she had to let him go because he'd chosen his life, and his life wasn't her. Still a 1/4 mile from the guest house, she heard the familiar drone of the Dodge coming up behind her, and she couldn't stop the smile. "Hey, stranger," Keith said through the open passenger window. "What are you doing out in these parts?" She turned to him, and when she found the other side of the pickup empty, her heart nearly wouldn't let the words out. "Rescuing my car from your barn?" That brought a slice of worry across his face. "What, are you escaping?" "Enjoying my day off." Maggie was still walking, and he was driving very slowly next to her. "Day off? Wow, they actually let you out of prison." She laughed. "It's not that bad." He drove a little farther. "You know, we are going the same direction if you hadn't noticed. Why don't you get in, and then you wouldn't have to walk?" "I like walking. I'm showing off my new tennis shoes, remember?" She lifted her foot high so he could see them. "Nice." His face said he clearly did remember. "Well, before you wear them out." He stopped and reached across the seat to pop the door open for her. Maggie beat back every feeling of the wonderful familiarity of getting in his pickup. Once inside, familiar had never felt so safe. "So you're going into town then?" he asked as the pickup made its way the last 300 yards to the turn beyond the guest house. "Yeah, I've got to cash my paycheck so I can pay you back." Confusion dropped on his face. "Pay me back? For what?" "Gee, you have a long memory. Clothes? Walmart? Shopping? Does any of this ring a bell?" It was so weird to be talking to him like this. With his beat-up cowboy hat over the light blue bandana, she would never have guessed how he looked at the party on Saturday. It was like he wasn't even the same person. Or maybe that person wasn't the same as this one. She couldn't really tell how he could be both. "You don't owe me anything." "Hey, now, that was the deal, remember? You buy them, I pay you back." The pickup bounced past the last knot of trees into the clearing where the barn stood. "Yeah, but—" "Besides," she said, and she couldn't stop the smile, "I got paid." She held up the envelope with her check. "So I don't have to be a mooch anymore." When he looked at her and smiled, there was no condescension anywhere in it. "Good for you." The pickup rolled to the barn, and he parked so her car would be able to get out. At the barn door, she watched as he unlatched the bolt and pulled it down. He made it look so easy. The door swung open. "There you go, safe and sound." "Well, thank you very much." She turned to him, and her heart did a flip-flop. "I guess I'll see you tonight." The word slammed into Keith like a brick. Tonight? Oh, yeah. She hesitated for a second. Dallas's party? That is tonight, right? His thoughts swirled as if in a blender. Oh, yeah, that's tonight. She asked you? No, Greg Parker called me. It's the funniest thing. We just met the other night at the party, but he seems like such a nice guy. Besides, I figured he's your friend, so how bad can he be, right? There was teasing in her tone and her eyes, but Keith's brain was having a hard time getting past her being with Greg. Oh, yeah, right. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. Then Maggie smiled. Well, miles to go and not much time to get there. Be good. I'll see you tonight. And with that, she got in her car, got it started, and backed out past him standing at the barn doors. With a wave, she started off. Just as she got to the trees, he remembered. Maggie! But she was gone. When she came back, he would have to open the door for her. He wished he had thought to ask her when that would be. He wished he could just think logically about anything when she was around. Then the thought of her with Greg twisted through him. Greg was a nice guy. He would surely treat her right. That wasn't the problem. It was worse than that. It was that he never wanted to see her with anyone else. Ever. Maggie was so bad at this. Shopping was not her specialty. She didn't know the first thing about what looked right together and what didn't. Growing up, she was just happy if it didn't fall off and only had a couple of holes. Now, inexplicably, here she was trying to find something that would conceivably compete with all the other girls who were sure to be at this party. She couldn't outdo them. That was a given. All she hoped for was to not look like someone's poor stepniece that nobody wants around. Rack after rack she looked. She even tried a few things on, but the fits weren't right and the prices were worse. God, what am I going to do? She asked the one who had become her best friend when there were no others around. She looked in the mirror at the off-shoulder lime green thing she was wearing. It was awful. Nothing about it looked right. Quickly, she checked the watch she had bought at the last store she couldn't find anything at. Great. Now, on top of not having anything to wear, she was going to be late. Look, God, I know I have no right to ask for a miracle at this point, but I'm asking anyway. Please, what am I going to wear? It wasn't until she was in her own clothes and pulling her white sneaker on that the thought occurred to her. The dress, the one from Walmart. She had hung it in her closet in the very back, thinking it was too nice to wear at work. Presumably, it was still there. Her memory slid down it, and she decided that yes, it would work, provided it actually fit. Of course, there was no way to know that, considering she'd never actually tried it on. It was the one she had figured on taking back the minute he put it in the cart. Ugh. Why did every single train of thought always lead her right back to him? Maggie girl, you've got to put him out of your head. He's taken. Dallas taken. They are together. You are not. Stop thinking about him. But that was easier said than done. How many times Keith had been up and down the road leading to the guest house that day, he had no idea. The excuses were endless, and by 4 o'clock, he was beginning to hope Ike wouldn't catch on. Man, I forgot to grab the extra ropes from my garage at lunch, Keith said. Tanner said he needed them for tomorrow. You know, I think Dallas must have fried your brains, Ike said with a laugh. You're a mess. That's one way to put it. Gee, I'd hate to see you after the honeymoon. You ain't going to get any meaningful work done for a year. Keith shook his head at the implication. I'm going to run over and get them. Ike waved him off, and Keith escaped from the office with a sigh of relief. Now, if she would just show up so he could help her, he wouldn't have to come up with some other lame excuse. Eventually, Ike was going to get suspicious. How he made that bolt look like it would slide through butter, Maggie had no clue. Sweat popped out on her forehead as she took hold of it with both hands and pulled. She had the feeling that even if she hung on the thing, she wouldn't be able to get it to unlatch. Grrr! Taking hold of it again, she yanked. Once, twice. Just before she actually tried the hanging on it thing, she heard the drone of the Dodge and her gaze snapped up the trail. Self-consciously, she let go and backed up as she watched him drive toward her. When he stopped, his grin could have been no bigger. "You need some help?" He slid out of the pickup, looking every bit the rugged, hard-working ranch hand cowboy. Those arms, sleek and tan, bulged from beneath the dirt-stained denim shirt, and Maggie had to force herself to breathe. "That would be nice." She shaded her eyes with her hand as she backed farther from the barn door. He stepped in front of her. "Ike going easy on you these days?" He twisted slightly. "What's that mean?" "You've spent more time here today than working." Then the thought of why scratched across her brain. "Oh, yeah. I bet Dallas has got you going crazy over the party, huh?" "Oh, no, not really." He slid the bolt out of the holder with ease. She put her hands on her hips. "Now, how did you do that? I've been out here for 10 minutes trying to do that." "It's not hard. You just have to know the secret." He smiled at her wickedly. "Uh-huh. And you're going to keep my car hostage by not telling me this secret?" He leaned on the barn door and folded his arms across his chest as he sized her up. "Well, if you're really nice." "Hey now, when have I not been nice to you?" She was teasing, but his face fell just the same. He turned back for the door. "It's easy. You just have to push the door in a little bit." With one hand, he pushed the door. With the other, he slid the bolt up and down into the latch with no problem. Maggie still wasn't convinced. She stepped up into the space between him and the door. "Let me try that." Reaching up with one hand, she took hold of the bolt. Then, with the other and her hip, she pushed on the door. Sure enough, the bolt slid free with nearly no effort. Wow, that's some secret. Keith felt like all the air in the meadow had evaporated. 3 inches from him, she stood in her yellow top and 3/4-length pants, looking all smart and sassy. With everything he had, he wanted to reach out to her, put his arms around her, and forget about everything else in his life. She worked the bolt a few more times to make sure there wasn't some catch. Then she let the bolt down and pulled the door open. Ha! Now my car isn't a hostage. Deflecting the feelings of wanting her, he crossed his arms again. "What makes you think it was a hostage to begin with? All you had to do was knock on my door and say, 'Keith, could you come help me?'" She tossed her hair over her shoulder. "What, like some little damsel in distress? I can handle things on my own just fine, I'll have you know." "Uh-huh. Like smoothie on the ceiling fine?" At first, she looked hurt, but then her eyes glinted when she realized he was teasing. "That was a fluke." "And falling down the stairs?" Annoyance crossed her face. "Nerves." "And being caught out in the rain with no umbrella?" Her face scrunched. "I never did that." He grinned. "Give it time." Grr. She reached out and whacked the side of his arm with her hand. However, in the next second, she was yelping in pain. "Ow! What are you made of? Steel?" At first he laughed. Then the thought of how many problems that would solve crossed through him. "No, unfortunately, flesh and bones." "Yeah," she said, still shaking her hand. "Hard ones." "Come on, let's get this car taken care of. I'll run you back up to the mansion." "Yeah, I'd hate to be late when Greg gets here." It was like a punch to the gut. "Yeah, we'd hate for that to happen." Maggie drove the car in and made a point of working the bolt herself when she came back out.
It was not fair for a guy to stand around looking that good. It just wasn't. She was having enough trouble getting her brain to think clearly as it was. Those muscles, that tan, that smile, they all called to her senses, threatening to take her places that she knew she could never go. She jumped into the pickup, glad for the cool air of the air conditioner. When he slid in behind the wheel, she knew she had to say something casual and friendly, lest her mouth take her where her heart wanted to go. "You've been out working today?" He glanced over at her. That hat, the bandana. Her brain kept cataloging every single thing she liked about him. "Trying to get Dragnet ready for Oak Tree." In his voice, there was darkness lurking in the corners. "And that's not going well?" "Oh, Dad just has no patience with the really important things. He gave us till May to have him ready, and there's just no way that's going to happen." After a moment, he sighed and slid down in the seat as they crossed back onto the road. "Not that it matters to me much anymore." "Why's that?" He glanced at her. "May. By June, I'll be out of here, and it'll be his problem." That whacked her backward in the seat. "You're leaving, then?" It seemed he couldn't get comfortable as he shifted side to side. "Dallas has this place picked out in the Woodlands. That's a little too far to commute every day." Oh. Somehow she hadn't realized he'd be leaving. The pickup rolled to the front of the mansion and stopped. "Well, this is it," he said, looking over at her. She fought to smile. "Yeah, I guess I'll see you tonight." "Sounds like a plan."
Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel so you never miss a second of the story.
This has been Deep in the Heart, written by Staci Stallings. Narrated by Becky Doughty of Brave Hearts Audiobook Productions. Copyright 2010 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings.